2012 meeting of the Historic Landmarks Commission. First item on the agenda is public comment. Any member of the public may address the Historic Landmarks Commission for up to 2 minutes on any subject within our jurisdiction that is not scheduled on the agenda. Seeing no public, I will close public comment and go to approval of the minutes of the HLC meeting of January 18th. Do I have a motion?
Second.
Motion by Boucher, second by Sharp. Under discussion, any additions, corrections, or clarifications? Commissioner Drury.
Item 7, under the motion, I think that should read the southwest corner of where the ficus is.
So on item number 1, comment number 7,
Yes.
propose a replacement tree for the removal of the ficus on the southeast corner?
Southwest.
Southwest.
I think I misspoke. It's not northwest, it's the southwest corner.
Yes, that would be the southwest.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? All in favor of the minutes?
Aye.
Opposed?
Abstain.
2 abstentions, Murray and Orias. Okay, next item on the agenda is consent calendar.
Mr.
Staff.
Chair. Yes.
Ms. Gantz.
Thank you. Item A, 340 West Carrillo Street was final approval with a condition. Item B, 530 State Street was final approval, project design approval and final approval with a condition. And then item B, 530 State Street is project design approval and final approval as submitted. Item C, 819 Chapala Street was preliminary design approval and final approval as noted. Item D, 517 Chapala Street was preliminary design and final approval as submitted. And item E at 1816 State Street was project design approval and final approval as submitted. And those were all reviewed by Commissioner Schallenberger.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Schallenberger. Do I have a motion to ratify the consent calendar?
Second.
Motion by Boucher, second by Drury. All in favor? Opposed? Motion.
Sharp abstains.
Sharp abstains. Motion carries. Next is announcements, requests by applicants for continuances, so on and so forth. Ms. Gantz?
Mr. Chair, just announcing that on today's agenda, the first item at 101 West Montecito Street was inadvertently placed on the agenda, so it was supposed to be continued indefinitely
That's what I thought.
from the February 1st meeting, so that item won't be heard today. And item 2 will be heard at that time instead. And then I believe Mr. Limon has an announcement.
Mr. Limon. Okay.
Yes, I just wanted to report back to you that myself and Michael Berman were given the opportunity to attend a California Preservation Foundation workshop seminar in Los Angeles, Baldwin Hills, where we had the opportunity to talk to some folks from Los Angeles and from the state office dealing with topics such as documentation requirements and the whole designation process through the California Register, National Register nominations. And it was held at the Village Green. It's a apartment complex in Los Angeles that's on National Register status now. And they walked us through the complex, which was kind of interesting, that has taken advantage of the Mills Act contract to bring the buildings back to life. These buildings were constructed in the 40s, and they were notable because I believe Reginald Johnson designed them. Yeah, that village. And what's unique about it, they called it an experimental project at the time, but essentially it's a park-like setting. I don't know if you're familiar. Some people are nodding your heads. That really brought California into the mindset of increasing a lot of open space into these settings. So it's like a park. You walk in these units, and you've got a park out there in front of the homes. And you can't see the cars from anywhere in the complex. It's really designed in a unique way. And over 600 units in the complex. So I wanted to also announce that there are other conferences that they're scheduling, and they seem to be more regular. They have actually webinars now that they're putting online that will serve as also training tools. So we're going to take advantage of those webinars, and if they're really interesting, we're hoping to try to tape them and try to have you look at them. One of them coming up is on landscapes and on conserving windows, and some tricks and unique techniques for that. So hopefully I'll be able to report back to you on those things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other announcements? I will need to leave by 3:30, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. Excuse me, 3:45. Okay, subcommittee reports. Anyone?
I have a report from this morning's sign committee meeting.
Okay.
I think it's...
Is your microphone on?
I'm reporting from this morning's sign committee meeting. I have received a lot of information and discussion on the subject of the Starbucks sign on Carrillo Street. And as of this morning, they will find another Starbucks starting up somewhere in this country for the sign they have there now, and they will replace it with a wooden sign, which is proper for EPV.
Great.
So I think that was a good thing.
Okay. Appreciate that, Commissioner Boucher. Anyone else? Any subcommittee reports?
Sure.
Yes, Commissioner Schallenberger.
Just Ellen Conto, basically just it's not really a subcommittee update, but more of a construction progress update, just to remind folks that that is proceeding, and they're making significant progress these days. And La Entrada, State and Cabrillo, they are, I talked with the planner for the project, and they are proceeding with starting to get their building department submittals together, and so there is progress on some of these major things that have been happening behind the scenes lately. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Schallenberger. Anyone else? I have just one simple one. I attended the Street Tree Advisory Committee meeting of February 2nd, and items that concern the Historic Landmarks Commission are the project at 101 West Montecito Street, and that's basically the train station parking lot and the culvert that goes underneath that parking lot. If you remember, there were about 11 Syzygium paniculatum, the brush cherry, that were proposed to be removed, and we had discussion on that. The Street Tree Advisory Committee supported the removal of those trees. However, they thought it was very unfortunate that they had to be removed, and they would be looking for something of similar value and configuration for that park area. And then lastly, there was discussion on a new designation for street tree at the 0 block of West Mason Street. If you all remember the bridge we've reviewed there at West Mason, the discussion was to look at possibly jacaranda or magnolia. So that's it. No decision was made at that time. Okay, then we will go on to the regular agenda, and the first item would be item number 2, 601 Paseo Nuevo. Since we don't have an
Mr.
applicant.
Chair, I think they're in the hallway. I'll call him
okay.
in. I'll call him in.
You want me to just shout, hey, get in here. And this is a second concept review. The project was last reviewed on February 1st. Action may be taken if sufficient information is provided. This is, good afternoon. This is a proposal for an 85 square foot addition and new storefronts to an existing building. Also proposed is a new outdoor dining patio with planter pot railing, tables and chairs. If you could have a seat and introduce yourselves for the record.
Hi, I'm Clay Arell with AB Design Studio, architect for the project.
Welcome.
Next to me is Joe Reeves from AB Design Studio.
Welcome.
Thank you. I've got a color set here in the middle, and if I can get this off, I'll get you sets for the other side. Full house today.
And we have a new improved pointer.
Oh, chopstick with some ink on it. Perfect.
I can read the comments from the last meeting, which was February 1st, as I mentioned. It was continued 2 weeks. The color palette as presented is acceptable. Overall, the proposal's design element details are consistent with the style details of the rest of Paseo Nuevo. The architectural style throughout the proposed project needs to have more consistency. Address the style consistency with the rest of the project for the specific details of the trellis, the outdoor furniture, and the outdoor dining railing. Beef up the metal stock on the outdoor dining railing, and consider replacing or removing the existing uplights. Study the spacing on the pickets on the outdoor railing, and study the reveals on the door heads, and explore using different window material than anodized aluminum.
Great. We'll just march down the line.
Okay?
Trying to keep this concise. The first comment about the color palette, we brought it again with us for those who didn't see it before, but we understand that that's appropriate. You'll notice that we took the flowery uplights off per some comments from the commissioners, and we're not proposing to put anything back. We think it looks better just clean. So that's that one change. I think that was item 5. Let's kind of dive into this a little bit. We looked at the storefronts. We're proposing a metal window system for the storefronts that would be factory painted, not anodized, in the dark color that we've proposed. Sorry, get us to some pages that make sense here. All right.
Okay, we're on sheet A4.01. If you could hold off until everybody gets there. If you could hold off, Clay, until everybody gets there.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll come back to the railing detailing, but I wanted to point out on this elevation, on the Chapala elevation, there was a comment made about continuing this detail through on that window as well. So we did go ahead and do that because we thought that was a very good comment. So we've kept that concept there. This hasn't changed. The railing has changed slightly, and this is consistent with what you saw last time. I'm going to go to A402.
Okay, A402. Hold off a second.
Sorry. Just making sure that was off. It was buzzing.
Okay, go ahead.
So on the trellis, we restudied this trellis. We came up with kind of a different idea, which is a little bit more consistent with some of the design elements we had. It's basically a metal framed canopy with the recycled wood as sort of a trellis cover slatting that you don't see in elevation, but we have a detail for that. The pickets on the railings will come back. We've kind of hit all the comments, so I'll just get into some of the details.
Okay, let's
We're
go to A9.01.
A901.
You could hold off. Everybody's there. Go ahead.
So
Clay.
last time we talked about some of these furnishings, and we've been talking to our client. We're really pushing towards using some of these reclaimed tables and things. So we've done a detail of what that would look like with sort of a standard metal dark black I think it's black painted base with a reclaimed wood top that would look similar to this with sort of a metal banding around it. These are just the benches that are within the Paseo. We still like going with these metal chairs. Ironically, I saw these at the patio of Cielito recently, which you guys recently reviewed. But we still like going in this direction. The railing, we wanted to bring a little bit more wood in, so we were looking at the idea of doing a wood post with a wrought iron picket in between. And these are 1 inch stock on. I believe we did 1 inch on the top, 3/4 in between, and that we spaced them out a little bit more appropriately. So we like the idea of bringing kind of a wood element and tying that back in to the facade changes. This is an example of what we were looking at for door hardware on the front. This is a Rocky Mountain hardware spec, just kind of a dark iron handle, and then we do have some lights by the front entry door. That we were looking at doing something similar.
Can you show us on elevation quickly where those lights are? Yeah.
Thanks. Hold on. Other one, A402.
A402.
We just need something at the door, so they're sort of flanking the front here.
I'm sorry, what is that? While we're looking,
That's an existing fire alarm element that's on the building today. There's
so one of them
actually
goes.
two of
One
them,
of them
so
goes
we're
away.
proposing to take one out, but those are existing, and there's a picture of them.
Okay,
in our
that's
thing,
all right.
but
It's existing.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can take one of them away, but we need to keep the other.
Okay. And sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Nope, no problem at all. And then we've just done some basic details of our systems.
Does everybody want to go to
this is-
A9.02? Okay, go ahead.
This
Clay.
would be at the
Starts from left to right. Entry
left
is-
to right. So entries here. Here's a detail of that kind of the trellis here. We have a blow up of that, but basically just a simple door, 10-inch kick. It would be the like a metal window system. We've taken the pigeon roosts off the top here and the bottom. So we've just taken that and wrapped it with wood and just made it a little bit simpler, which I think is a good approach, a good comment.
Okay, A9.03.
So,
Hold off, please.
yep.
Okay, go ahead.
So again, getting back to this trellis, here's the transom, wood transom over the entry door on the Paseo side, and then we're doing a dark painted channel with reclaimed wood slats kind of over the top of that. So it just kind of announces the entry, but we're trying to keep it kind of simple and not too overly done. And these would be all square stock iron and dark painted as well.
Talk a little bit about the hardware there.
This was just a real simple idea to keep it, not very elaborate. It's not, we didn't want to add a lot of ornamentation, so we're doing a very simple kind of connection that we think sort of fits with the architecture and the styling of everything else we're doing, trying to be as consistent as possible. I think on A904, again, just a few more window and door details, system details for the different conditions.
All right, do we have any questions from the commission? Were you all done? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
okay.
think everything else, the colors are here if we want to talk
Okay,
about
Commissioner
it.
Schallenberger, questions? Hold off, please. Let's finish with this paper wrestling, if we...
I'm going to be wrestling paper.
Okay. If you could speak as loud as possible.
The wood posts in the railings,
Yeah.
species and finish.
What we want to do is keep with the reclaimed wood idea, so we're not exactly sure what that's going to be yet.
Okay.
Kind of researching different options and what we can get that's...
But try to match what you're doing.
The idea is
Okay.
it would tie all in,
Okay.
yes.
And detail 2 on A903, the trellis, is the C-channel aphasia, is that 3 sides? In other words, does it cap
Yeah,
the ends?
yeah, it comes out and around.
Thank you.
You're talking about this here.
Yeah, it's
wraps
in section.
around,
It
yeah.
wraps on the both sides.
Okay. Any other questions? Commissioner Winnick? Commissioner Orias, any questions?
In reviewing the discussion that you had in the previous meeting, there was a question about the wood awning on A402, the alignment, not, the elements were not properly aligned. Have you done that?
We actually redesigned that,
You just dropped your mic.
Commissioner Reyes. We just redesigned that completely, so that alignment
Okay.
issue is not pertinent to the discussion anymore.
Okay. And let's see, well, there was one other question I wanted to ask. There was a concern about the trellis needing to be convinced that it works with the project. Do you feel that you've addressed that problem?
Yeah, I believe the comment was to revise it to be more consistent with the other design elements, and this is what we've put forth. We feel that it's consistent.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop here now and go to public comment. Mr. DeForest. Excuse me, would you mind giving up your chair for Mr.
No,
DeForest?
I don't. I can get by.
Okay.
I'm not going to talk very long. Good afternoon, Kellum DeForest. I would like to know, has any thought been given for the fencing, those posts and rails, separating the dining area from the sidewalk to be removable in case of a fire or special events? I'm a little concerned about the narrowing of the entrance to the Paseo and the exiting of people in case of emergency. Thank you.
Okay, I'll close public comment now and go back to the commission with questions. Yes, Commissioner Arias, any questions?
One more chair item. I agree with Mr. DeForest. There was a comment that the fire department, you were going to check with the fire department for accessibility. Have you done so?
Let's go to the plan here and where it shows those locations of the outdoor dining.
If I may, I'll address Mr. DeForest's comment. There's a requirement for those posts to be removable, so they'll be mounted with a plate, and then they'll be able to be removed and taken out, so that it won't affect
But have
that.
you checked with the fire department?
We have to keep, we need to keep 16 feet clear here to come through, and for a fire lane access into the Paseo, so we've maintained that.
Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Lavoie, any questions? Commissioner Murray, questions?
I'm sorry I wasn't here last time, but I was curious. The idea of reclaim redwood, would that inspiration come from any part in the building itself, or?
Well, the company coming in here is called Eureka Burger, and this is about their 6th or 7th restaurant that they've opened in the Central Coast to LA region. And a big part of their brand identity is using reclaimed woods and natural materials. They use it on the interior, they use it for interior wood on the walls, they use it for tables, and so we were bringing that expression of that interior aesthetic to the exterior facade. That's where that originated from.
And do you think that kind of thing is compatible with the existing design of this building?
Well, I believe it works, and I believe that given you weren't here for the last part as well. What seems to be consistent about, as we studied the Paseo Nuevo, what's consistent is that there isn't anything consistent with storefronts, and there's a wide array of things. One of the commissioners mentioned that we're using sort of a material that's older and in a new fashion that's a little bit more modern, but the idea is that it's old and it's sort of a craft. So, I think that it's still fitting within what we're trying to do, and it helps strengthen the brand of the tenant.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Sharp, questions?
Yeah, one question on the trellis.
Let me go back to that trellis, please. Whoops. That would be on Nope.
903. 903.
903. How did I miss it?
Are there any intermediate supports?
Yeah, you're actually seeing that in elevation here. There's an intermediate support midspan, and then there's an angle iron on the backside of these.
I saw that, but I only saw one.
Yeah,
I
there's
didn't know if that was in
one.
the center or where.
The span is 12 feet, so we're planning on one intermediate section.
Okay.
And that's a 2x8 up there. A 2x. Yeah, it's a 2x, so
Yeah.
you shouldn't have any problem with deflection. Commissioner Schallenberger?
Since while we're here,
Uh-huh.
this graphically looks like the trellis is somewhat centered in this wood head, the bulkhead above the door. Is that the intent?
Yeah,
To sort of center it.
we looked at it a couple different ways, but we felt that worked.
Okay. Thanks.
Commissioner Boucher, any questions?
Not at this time.
Commissioner Drury?
I do not.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, we'll go to comments. Commissioner Drury, any comments?
Excuse me. I think the only comment I have is I like the design much better than I did 2 weeks ago. It's very simple, and I approve it. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Boucher, any questions?
Comments?
I mean, comments. Thank you.
What are we on?
Comments.
Thank you.
Be sure to turn your microphone on.
Thank you. One thing that's concerned me on State Street is if these outdoor areas are no longer being used, they're taken up. And in one instance, in the 1000 block of State Street, they've put duct tape over the holes where the poles went in before, and it looks un-Hispanic.
When they remove the railing?
Yes. So I was just wondering if you had any kind of a a way of coping with that, like capping it or something. If should you do this?
We'll make them never remove it ever.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Just think about it, because
Okay.
I pass that, being a pedestrian, I pass that all the time, and every time I pass it, I say,
The way we had intended to do it was with a plate that you screw into, so
Yeah.
if it was removed, you'd have
the
a
plate.
left. but,
Okay. That would look
it
better
wouldn't
than
just be
duct tape.
Duct tape over the
Okay.
hole.
Okay. Commissioner Sharp, any comments?
Yeah, I'm still not altogether convinced that the trellis works. It is still a place for all sorts of birds to be up there, and it's going to end up with those vertical things. And I think just a bunch of boards laying on top of a steel frame is not appropriate for the district, especially this close to Chapala Street, a major, if it was thoroughfare, if it was back in the innards of the Paseo Nuevo would be another thing, but it just is not refined enough in its design, in my opinion.
Okay. Commissioner Murray?
I can't really comment because I wasn't here last time.
Okay. Okay. Commissioner, what's your face? Lovaway. Yeah.
I agree with Commissioner Sharp. I think the trellis is perhaps too industrial a solution. I appreciate the other changes, and I would support them, particularly the devising rail. And I wish the light fixture was a little bit more of a design than just an off-the-shelf, generic, sort of acceptable Hispanic light fixture, considering we've allowed you to push the limit on everything else.
Okay. Commissioner Arias?
I agree with Commissioner Sharp on the trellis. I think it has some problems and should be really restudied and worked on. I like the fact that you've gotten away with the former circular window that was at Ruby's. And all, you've come a long way on this design, and it's very attractive. I like the reusing of the wood and things like this, but I do think there is a problem with the trellis. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Winnick?
I like the scheme overall. I think it works very well, and I think there are comments from last time have been addressed. I think I differ from Mr. Sharp on one issue, and I guess I actually liked having a little bit more detail above those window bulkheads. And I understand the concern about pigeons and projecting too far, but I guess I kind of liked that one element that was in the scheme last time where those horizontal pieces came out and projected. I was wondering if there was a possibility, I should have asked this during the comment period, or the question period, if there was a possibility of doing that but just not sticking out so far so it doesn't give pigeons a perch. So I think it gives it a little more variety to those components, that you get that horizontal line. I could approve the project either way, just so you know.
Commissioner Schellenberger?
No, just generally positive comments. I like the design.
Okay, let me finish my comments.
Sorry.
No, go
I
ahead.
didn't really talk about the furniture, but I think looks like the applicant has narrowed it down from the previous review, and I think that the proposed tables and bench and chairs and pedestal base is all acceptable.
Okay. I'll sum up the comments, and if somebody wants to make a motion with those comments, feel free. Okay. The design is acceptable and has progressed from the last presentation. The Commission appreciates the change from the existing architecture. Study a solution for covering the post holes if the posts are removed. The trellis is not refined enough. It is too industrial and not quite traditional. The light fixtures should be more traditional. Okay. Okay. The light fixtures should be more in keeping with the other design elements. And study adding the horizontal element back to the door heads, but eliminating the possibility of bird perching. Does anybody really like all those comments and want to make a motion? Commissioner Schellenberger.
The discussion about removal of the bollards, the applicant actually does address that in the detail notes. There is some language that says that they'll insert plugs.
Okay, great.
I think they've already really addressed that.
Then strike the comment that says study a solution for covering the post hole. Okay.
I'll make a motion for 2-week continuance with those comments.
Okay, we have a motion by Lavoie,
I'll
second
second
by
that.
Orias. Any additional comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. You are on your way. Get out. No, just kidding.
Not done writing.
I know.
That segues right into the next item.
It's true.
Closes the
I have
meeting.
one. Yeah. And we made that comment the last time.
Okay.
So, yeah. So there you go, Ms. Gantz.
Yeah.
And we will, we're adjourning, right? Even though we're not.
Yes. that's
Okay,
correct.
yeah. We will adjourn the February 15th
Can I hang on
HLC.
to that? Yeah, thanks.
And we need to wait 5 minutes for the camera.
agendas, HLC agenda's been really light.
Yes.
To practically nothing.
Yes.
Everybody wants to come back in 2 weeks. Everybody is trying to submit for 2 weeks from now, on the 29th. And we already have a 90-minute Natural History Museum item that's going to be on there, so that's going to
Able
impact the
to
agenda.
get Mary Lou to move.
I asked
So
her
what
to,
you're
and
saying
she
is
said she would.
Where I thought we were going to say, let's do
I'm
it
going
in 3
to
weeks.
remind
you're
her.
gonna say
We have a meeting a week
Forget
from
it.
today. I'm going to remind her one more time.
Okay, because
Actually, the Natural History
She
Museum will
admitted that
take
she'd
5
let it
minutes.
slide.
oh yeah, she has.
Yeah, she was very open about that. No excuses, just, yeah, you're right, kind of thing.
Well, the thing is that unless we do it her way, she's going to. It's between us.
Might be the first item.
On the element, historic element, she made it very clear that she had to have the final word on everything. And she was gone for a long time. And
I'm guessing we have 25, maybe 30 people in here that went through the earthquake. I know one person that called up was 16 months old when she went through the earthquake and remembers her crib rolling back and forth. Last night on KEYT, I hope you saw that we had 2 people on there. We had one guy who said his father had pulled him out of his crib just as the chimney came crashing through the ceiling. So with saying that, first I want to ask, how many of you like earthquakes? How many of you love Santa Barbara and our climate? Well, I don't see why you're afraid of earthquakes then, because if it wasn't for the earthquake, we would not have the great city and the great climate that we have. All of it due to the earthquake. Now, we all know about the San Andreas Fault that runs from the Mexican border up through San Francisco, and it kind of runs in a big straight line, except, we'll use my arm because I didn't bring a map, there's like a little elbow at one point, so it's not a straight line. It catches at this one little elbow point, and that's that pressure point causes lateral fractures, they call them, which run east and westward, and that's what has created our Santa Ynez Mountains. That little elbow thing caused those mountains to come up. Very unusual to have east-west mountains. With our south-facing coast and those east-west mountains, as you watch on KEYT every night with Gabe and watching the weather, you see how the winds come up and change because we have this wonderful mountain blockage. And the Riviera was caused by earthquake faults, as was the Mesa. So without earthquakes, we would not have the beautiful climate and the beautiful views. But let's take a look at what some earlier people thought of earthquakes. This is a Chumash cave painting. And I think it represents an earthquake, because it looks like these people here are just jumping up and down, and there's a little split of the earthquake fracture. Well, the Chumash, of course, had earthquakes, and they knew what caused them. The Chumash said there are 3 worlds in our universe. The upper world is the world of gods and spiritual beings. The lower world is the world of all the evil spirits, and the middle world is the world of man. And this world is surrounded by a great shining sea, and it's held up by 2 giant serpents. And when they get tired of holding this up, they kind of move their backs a little bit, and the earth shakes, and that's why we have earthquakes. And actually, I like that idea. It makes a lot more sense to me than secret things sliding underground beneath us that we don't know about. It's kind of spooky thinking all these faults are shifting around. Well, leaving the Chumash behind, we'll move into the Spanish era. The first account of an earthquake in California that has been written down comes from the Portola expedition of 1769. They were a land expedition. They started off from Baja, California, came up, stopped at San Diego, founded a mission, and then headed up on foot through the uncharted territory of California, trying to find San Francisco Bay. Well, they were in the Los Angeles Basin in July of 1769, when they were camped beside a river, when they experienced a whole series of earthquakes within the next 4 or 5 days. So severe were these earthquakes that they named this place, and without really thinking what it might do to future property values, they named it the Rios de los Temblores, the River of the Earthquakes. And actually where they were camped was the Santa Ana River, which passes through Santa Ana, which is probably a more sellable name than Rios de los Temblores. As they went northward, they also found huge pools of asphaltium or oil or bitumen, whatever you want to call it, which we know today as La Brea tar pits. And they were wondering about this. They thought that all this stuff bubbling to the surface might have something to do with earthquakes. So they wrote that in their journal. They didn't know why or what it was for, but it might be. Well, so we soon settled California, and for the next 30 years, everything was very quiet. It was sort of like California and nature were giving us time to get adjusted to the land. And then in 1800, they hit us with a huge earthquake that was felt all the way from San Diego up to Santa Barbara. In 1806, they gave us a few more earthquakes. And then in 1812, they really shook up the state. A series of earthquakes started in May of 1812 and carried all the way through December. And in fact, they called that the year of the earthquakes, I think, Año de los Temblores. And the 2 last earthquakes, the biggest ones, were in December, one on December 8th and one on December 21st. The December 8th earthquake, they figured, was around 7.2, 7.3 on the Richter scale. It destroyed San Juan Capistrano. I had to think of the birds coming back. It destroyed the San Juan Capistrano mission, killing 40 people inside the church. The December 21st earthquake demolished Mission La Purísima, which used to be in Lompoc. Some of you may know that if you go up to Lompoc and take, I think, 6th Street, you can come up to the ruins, and you can actually see this huge crevice that opened up in the hillside behind the mission, and there's still a few ruins left behind them. And it's kind of a little bit of foresight. The Padres had to move their mission now into the Santa Ynez Valley, where the current La Purísima mission is. But in their annual report, the two Padres from the earlier La Purísima wrote that experience may teach us the best method for constructing buildings, other buildings in California, because this earthquake thing was kind of new. Well, in Santa Barbara, the earthquake was also felt. There are stories of a tidal wave up at Refugio Bay carrying a ship a half a mile inshore and out, and historians and geologists argue whether it really happened or didn't happen. In Santa Barbara, they say that water did come up as far as the Presidio, and the mission itself was slightly damaged, not too bad. And this is kind of what the mission may have looked like in 1812. The church itself looked pretty much like this, and the arcade was actually an open-topped arcade. But the Padres said, you know, our mission was damaged, our church was damaged, and why repair it? We need a bigger church anyway. So they went to their superiors and said, could we get more money to build a larger church? And in 1815, they got permission to build the larger church. And they figured, you know, with all the time we got to spend fixing it, why not just make a bigger one? So they did, but they needed to get a new design for it. And in the mission library, there just happened to be a book by an architect who lived in the 1st century before Christ. And his name was Marcos Vitruvius Polonius, or Polonio. I come across both names. And so they had this book, and in the exciting chapter 2 of his book on archaeology, he gave 4 designs that you could use for a temple. They had A, B, C, and D. So the Padres took a look at this book, and they decided B, for Barbara perhaps, was the best idea. And there we have 3 columns on either side of the door with a nice pediment along the top there. And so that's what they chose for Mission Santa Barbara. Following chapter 2 was chapter 4, because I'm skipping chapter 3. And the architect also said, well, look what else we can do with this. You can put statues on each corner of your little pediment along the top there. And so the mission fathers thought, well, that's a good idea. So thanks to a 1st century BC architect, we now had a design for the new Mission Santa Barbara. And when the mission opened, or the new mission was dedicated in 1820, it looked something like this. And you can see there's no roof over the arches there, and there's also no tower. But here's their 6 pillars, 3 on either side, and they also added that window in the center. I think they did that so they wouldn't get in trouble for stealing another architect's plan, so they kind of made it their own little thing. So it only had 1 tower, and then in the 1830s they added a 2nd tower which collapsed, and so then they rebuilt it again, and the little buttress that we see today helps support that 2nd tower that they added. By 1865, this is what it looked like. You can see they put a roof over the open arcade, and then they also started to enclose that and add rooms upstairs. So Mission Santa Barbara got its architecture out of this old architect's book from the 1st century. So in the 1850s, there was a number of earthquakes, nothing really big, just little shakers rolling around, until 1857. And the Santa Barbara Gazette, the newspaper at the time, reports that this January, I think it was January 9th, the city experienced a sharp jolt. 20 minutes later was a rolling motion which rocked the city for approximately 1 minute long. This earthquake was the Fort Tejon earthquake, and it is said to be the largest earthquake known to have hit California. It was about 8.2 to 8.3 on our Richter scale, and centered down in Fort Tejon, as the name suggests. In Santa Barbara, because as they said, it was a rolling motion for 1 minute, the ground rolled so hard, it rocked back and forth, that the Mission Reservoir, all the water started sloshing back and forth and eventually emptied and poured down the street in front of the Mission. Tulare Lake emptied itself also. It just flung out onto the shores. Rivers were washed out and all the water flung upon the shores. Up at Fort Tejon, there was a corral, which you know is in the shape of a big O or a square, and it was so offset by the earthquake it now formed the letter S. So it was a major earthquake. But luckily, it didn't do too much to Santa Barbara outside of stirring up the waters at the Mission Reservoir. This is how Santa Barbara looked around 1875. From our previous slideshows over the year, we know nothing really happened in the 1860s, so we always jump into the 1870s. And we can see the different building styles coming up. This is a view from Gutierrez Street to our back. Here's Haley Street, Anacapa Street over here, State Street at the far end. And we see adobe houses here, wooden houses going up there, new brick buildings lining State Street. So all these new building styles are coming into play in Santa Barbara. And a lot of people were finding Santa Barbara attractive and moving out here. Well, of course, people were scared of earthquakes in California, and so one of the first guidebooks for immigrants to come to Santa Barbara tells them that, well, remember, in 1812, there was a huge earthquake in the Mississippi Valley, and all this damage and people died from it. And they also noted that By the way, in New York City, more people die of sunstroke every summer than have died in an earthquake in Santa Barbara as far as recorded history has happened. And of course, they were right. And they're kind of shuffling the deck a little bit by not putting out some of the other things that happened here. But they tried to relieve people's angst about earthquakes striking Santa Barbara. Well, so here's a typical adobe house. And actually, if adobes, if they're well built, can withstand earthquakes quite well. But over the years, what happens if adobes aren't taken care of, as water drips off the roof, it starts to wear away down at the base where it splashes and hits up, and pretty soon that weakens the wall. And when an earthquake strikes, more than likely the adobe will fall down or collapse. And when these new settlers came out from the Midwest and from back east, they thought, you know, these adobes, they looked dirty, they were rat-filled, so they didn't like this, so they brought their own homes with them. So we have farmhouses appearing in Santa Barbara. We have the Victorian houses, and I know that there's various styles of Victorian architecture, but this is a typical type of a house that was built in Santa Barbara. This house, by the way, was built on Bath Street and later was moved over to on the back lot on Arriaga Street and been restored. So it's still there sitting on Arriaga between Bath and Castillo Street. So a typical house. And then we have some untypical houses. This is the Dibley Mansion that was built where City College currently stands. And so there were some magnificent structures. I'm not quite sure what to call that type of architecture, but it was large and outstanding. And actually, this withstood the earthquake of 1925 pretty well, not to give away any future talk. Well, as far as the churches went now, everybody thinks that Mission Santa Barbara is the center of Catholic worship in Santa Barbara. But actually, Our Lady of Sorrows Church was the parish church for Santa Barbara. This is the second Our Lady of Sorrows Church at the corner of State and Figueroa Street. Here's Figueroa across the front and State Street. An earlier church built in 1855 had burnt down, and so they built this second church in 1867. And it's out of adobe, typical sort of little A-top shape there, square. And so that was good enough for the Catholics. Well, as the Protestants started arriving in the late 1860s and early 1870s, they started to build their churches. And they had a bit more money at the time and also a bit better building designs. And so this is the Congregationalist Church at the corner of Santa Barbara and Ortega Streets, and built out of brick, beautiful windows recessed, a beautiful steeple pointing up to the heavens. And the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopalian Church all followed suit, all had these beautiful buildings with these great spires pointing heavenward. So the and also by the 1890s, we had even more magnificent, almost cathedral-like churches arising. This is the Unitarian Church at the corner of Arlington Avenue and State Street, right across from the Arlington Theater, where Carlito's Mexican restaurant still stands. And notice it's made out of nice, heavy, local sandstone, has this nice, big, huge turret hanging right over the sidewalk. So a beautiful cathedral for religion. Well, the Catholics tried their hardest to keep up with Our Lady of Sorrows. They took their old adobe church, and first they encased it, in the 1880s, they encased it in brick, and then they built these two bases for bell towers. And it wasn't until 1905 that they finally got these wooden bell towers added. The bells inside were so heavy and so huge, they were afraid that if they rang the bells, that it would rock and knock everything off the church. So inside the bases, they put concrete down below and put up huge timbers so it had its independent frame supporting the bells. So when the bells rang, the wood took all the way to the bells and nothing touched the insides of the church, so it all would ring and be clear. So this is sort of the Catholic way of upgrading and getting themselves into a more modernistic type of a church. And this design coming from back east also found its way into our courthouse, built in the 1870s, and the early 1890s, the Hall of Records. And pretty much as I've said in past slideshows, it looks as if somebody just plucked these buildings up out of Vermont and dumped them here in Santa Barbara. Now, the loss of these old adobes and the loss of this California tradition did not go unnoticed. As early as 1874, the editor for the local paper wrote in an editorial, "The old landmarks and most charming characteristics of Santa Barbara are disappearing before the march of improvements. And though our practical people cannot move the mountains or change the scenery nor spoil the climate, they are doing all they can to despoil the quaint beauty of this place and make it just a commonplace American town." And as the 1890s came along, even more people now are realizing this. The mission centennials of the 1880s brought about an awareness of what we were losing as the missions were falling into ruin and being restored. And there was a man named Charles Lummis, some say Loomis, Charles Lummis, who was a big promoter of preserving the California way and recognizing the adobes and the Spanish and the traditions and what was being lost. And so a movement started coming up to preserve all this stuff. But the biggest thing that happened for us to preserve the California architecture occurred in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. This is the California State Building for the World's Fair, and a San Francisco architect named Arthur Page Brown did the design for the State Building, and look what he chose. He chose Mission Santa Barbara as the focal point for his building. And he also added some interesting little touches, these recessed windows with different sort of star-shaped designs on them, this neat little mushroom cap here with red tile, archways here and there, but he followed this mission style up. Now remember, it's thanks to an earthquake that we have that mission from 1812. Without the earthquake, we never would have had that design. Brown is a busy fellow. That same year in the fall in San Francisco for the Midwinter Exposition, his design is for the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, and this one is purely this Moorish design here. Again, he's got these recessed windows with little stars and interesting shapes, arches and turrets and all kinds of neat stuff going on. And so now we've got this mission thing on one hand, and we've got this Moorish thing on the other hand. And I see it pop up. This is the first building, I think, in Santa Barbara to be built in this sort of mission Moorish style, and that's the old Los Baños del Mar, the bathhouse down along Cabrillo Boulevard, or West Cabrillo Boulevard, and Castillo Street. And we can see the neat little recessed windows here, the arches, and all this other stuff going on. So now we've got sort of the public buildings starting to pop up. But let's just roll back a little bit, because Arthur Page Brown is a busy boy. He did that Chicago thing, the San Francisco thing, and then he was also hired by Charles Crocker of San Francisco to build what I think is Santa Barbara's first planned neighborhood called Crocker Row between Mission Street and Padre Street here along Garden. 5 houses are built out there, and they're built in this mission, as they started to call it, a mission revival style. And here in the corner of Mission and Garden Street is Crocker Cottage number 1. Our friend Annette Carroll owns that. And over in the corner, there's the faithful dog that's been out there guarding that house for well over 100 years. And you know, every year, Annette, or every holiday, Annette puts some sort of bonnets and hats on that dog and dresses it up. And then I also want to add, let's take a look at Annette's house and see these nice pillars and the windows up along there, and see what happened for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where the architect took the front of the Mission and took the side of Annette's house, Crocker Cottage, and glued them together and put that out for us. So we're starting to see the Santa Barbara Mission showing up in a lot of architecture. And I also like this house at the corner of Pedregosa and Garden Street, the Hopkins house. A local boy, Francis Wilson, built this, and I forget the exact year, in 1896, 97, 98. And it's also got these little mission elements to it. But mainly when I look at this house, it reminds me of a Walt Disney cartoon. This looks like a little face, there's the eyes, and his little eyelids up above. And it looks like something you'd expect to see in a Disney thing as little kids go by and it starts talking to them, saying, "Don't take that pathway." 1902, the Potter Hotel, the architect John Austin from Los Angeles. I just backed up my train of thought. 1902, architect John Austin of Los Angeles put up the Potter Hotel, or did the plans for the Potter Hotel, which opened in 1903. And this was in this Moorish Spanish style also. Right behind the Potter in 1906, our local boy, Francis Wilson, designed the Mission Revival style Southern Pacific Railway Station. Coming along to 1911, we have Arthur Benton from Los Angeles, who gave us the new Arlington Hotel right across the street from us, and this spanned the entire block. The earlier Arlington Hotel had burnt down, so when Benton designed this Arlington, up in this beautiful Mission Tower, he put a 50 to 60,000 gallon water tank up there, so there was gravity feed for water and enough pressure all through the hotel, so that in case of a fire, they'd have plenty of water, plenty of pressure. Even though the building was primarily built out of concrete, brick, and hollow tile, they still wanted to have this on hand just in case of a fire. So these were just a few of the elements that are popping up, because we kind of think that the earthquake was what gave Santa Barbara its Spanish architecture. But a lot of these little things were starting to pop up here and there. But the number one thing for Santa Barbara that gave us our architecture is a man named Bernard Hoffman. Hoffman had come to Santa Barbara around 1919, 1920. If you were here for our talk on the Montecito Hilltop Barrens, remember that George Owen Knapp convinced Sansom to come to Santa Barbara, and because Sansom was doing experiments with diabetes, and there was special people that got to come out to be sort of his guinea pigs, his original 20, one of which was Bernard Hoffman's daughter. So the Hoffman family from back east comes to Santa Barbara, And how come it took an Easterner to take a look at Santa Barbara and what was being lost and what could be gained, I think is just astounding. And so this gentleman, Mr. Hoffman, bought the old De La Guerra adobe and the property around it, and with architect James Osborne Craig, he started to design and build what was called the El Paseo. And he said, this is the blueprint for Santa Barbara. This is what Santa Barbara should strive to. These beautiful buildings with these windows and arches. He called this section the Street of Spain, and there were shops and there was restaurants. The far-sighted Hoffman even thought that we should have all of our utilities underground. No more unsightly telephone poles and wires across the horizon. And in the early 20s, people started listening. And there was a Santa Barbara School for the Arts, which evolved into a group called the Community Arts Association, of which Hoffman was the president. And his young secretary was a woman named Pearl Chase. And they started influencing the city. They and a handful of other people got together and started saying, we need to have city planning. We need to have building codes. And slowly but surely, things started to change. Now, the same year that they were putting up the El Paseo complex, right across the street at the far end of De La Guerra Plaza, Tom Stork had hired architect George Washington Smith, who had become, I mean, his name is just about one with the Spanish architecture of Montecito homes and throughout Santa Barbara. But this is the building for the Daily News that George Washington Smith designed, and this was erected in 1922. So now anchoring De La Guerra Plaza, at the one end is this, at the other end the De La Guerra adobe and the El Paseo. And what used to be in the middle of the plaza here between these two palm trees was the old City Hall, built in the 1870s, built out of brick, pretty nondescript and boring looking. And so that got torn down, and on the opposite end of the plaza, the new City Hall arose in 1923. So now we've got this neat little circle right there of these great buildings. Then a block away, 1924, the Libero Theater opens up, another beautiful Spanish architecture building. And then in 1924, we also have the new Santa Barbara High School, built over on the east side along Anapamu, where it still resides today. So all these things are coming into play. But even so, for the most part, oh, I forgot, a new design in architecture happened in 1924 also, mainly in an upward direction when the Granada building opened with its 8 stories. Right after this opened up, the city decided it was, we have to have height limitations. So no more 8-story buildings. They put a residential height limit and a commercial height limit. But when I look at this picture, you know, we're so used to that giant Granada sign that runs all the way from here up to the 6th floor. And without this big Granada sign hanging on the front, it looks like, to me, it looks like as if John Palminteri shaved off his mustache before he goes on the news at KEYT. It just looks like somebody is just bald-faced right there. Well, despite these little changes that we've seen in this drive to get to Spanish architecture, for the most part, as we enter 1925, Santa Barbara looked like any town USA. And we were even able to have our own traffic jams back then. Forget these traffic jams of 2005. They did it just as well in 1925. Well, as we roll into 1925 and through the spring and into the summer, Santa Barbara is experiencing a real estate boom that you would not believe. In the first 2 weeks of April alone, almost $100,000 in property changed hands. One piece of property up on Anacapa and Los Olivos sold for the amazing price of $8,000, and frontage along State Street was even more expensive. And they just thought, how can this boom end? This is really great. Things are moving in Santa Barbara. As we roll into the last weekend of June, oh, I forgot, here we go. On June 19th, the brand new California Hotel opened down at State and Mason Street. And this hotel featured seawater baths or saltwater baths, which was a great, I don't know why it was a great thing, but people really enjoyed saltwater baths, so you could just walk down to the Pacific and take a dip if you wanted to. And because this was the only hotel like this between San Diego and San Francisco, people said, this hotel is going to be a great hit. So that opens up on June 19th, and then we move to the final week of June, and it was a hot one. The temperatures were hovering in the high 80s and low 90s throughout Santa Barbara and over in the valley. And on Sunday, June 28th, people escaped down to the beachfront and headed down to Plaza Del Mar to take in the concerts. There's always a nice band concert going down here. So residents and tourists alike hang out at the bathhouse or go down to West Beach. Oh, they don't. Oh, they also went up to the Mission. I forgot about that. Of course, we had to go to church on Sunday. And after the parishioners left, then all the tourists got to come up. And they also went to the beach. Here we go with the beachfront. And what I love about this is that, notice, they're wearing their suits and ties on the beach. Only in Santa Barbara do you look good no matter where you go. Well, late Sunday night, here's the interior of the Arlington, the front desk of the Arlington. Forgot where I was in the building. And there's 150 guests at the Arlington, and they're waiting for the business week to open. There was many dealers from the Ford Motor Company had come out because there was going to be a big conference about new ideas for the Ford Motor Company. And then about 11:15 that night, two of the last people checked into the Arlington, and that was Captain Alan Hancock, a banker from Los Angeles, and his ranch manager, Joe Chapman. And they were heading up to Hancock's ranch up in Santa Maria. And the story is that just as they were leaving the desk, the night clerk recognized Mr. Hancock and thought, well, he can't just get a regular room. We'll give him a suite. So Mr. Hancock was given a tower suite up here, but he knew his son Bertram was going to be coming up an hour later, so he said, well, why don't Joe Chapman and I take the room adjoining here, and when Bertram comes up, he can have the room there. In the room beneath them was a woman named Mrs. Charles Perkins, and she was the widow of a railroad president from the, I think, Chicago, Burlingame, and Quincy railroads. And she was a seasonal visitor to the Arlington, and so she took up her rooms here, and her personal maid, Vandella Pearson, was in the room next to her. And then about 1 o'clock in the morning, Bertram Hancock arrived, and he went up into his tower suite, and everybody went to sleep waiting for the Monday morning business to arise. Well, during the night, about 3:30 in the morning on June 29th, a slight earthquake rolled through Santa Barbara, but nobody really felt it. But about 10-15 minutes later, up on the mesa, the city manager, Herbert Nunn, woke out of his sleep because he had this strong smell of petroleum. And he thought, well, maybe the refineries down at Summerland are doing something and the wind is blowing it up here. So he went outside of his house, took a look around, and it was absolutely still. No air, no movement, but the smell of petroleum was so strong, he said it was almost nauseating. So he went back to his house and tried to go back to sleep. Well, the sun came up at 4:49 a.m. and did the usual June job of trying to burn off the overcast that we have, the June gloom. And farmers later mentioned that they remembered their animals were acting kind of strangely as they went out to feed them, and cats and dogs were acting a little odder than usual, people recalled. At 6 o'clock, the mission bells tolled, as they had done for over 100 years, calling the faithful to Mass. Because it was the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, there was going to be a high Mass at the mission, so therefore up in the choir loft to sing the high Mass was the Father Superior of the mission, Father Hobrecht, a couple of brothers, a couple of other fathers, and about 15 faithful parishioners had gathered inside the church for the Mass. Just behind the church here at the St. Anthony Seminary, John Shea, the gardener, started his morning work along there as the bells tolled and everybody got ready for work. Orthodontist James Engel left his house at 32 East Islay Street and headed down State Street to the San Marcos Building, the most prestigious business address in Santa Barbara, parked his car in front and went up to room 228, somewhere along in this section here. And he didn't have a patient up there, but he was just stopping off to do some routine work before he headed down to Los Angeles, where his wife's family was. And also just down the street, a man named Carl Sylvester, who was a driver for the Santa Barbara Meat Market, had stopped in front of the Bonton Market, unloaded his side of beef, was getting back in his truck, and was just starting to turn it on when he realized that his back tail latch was loose. And so he got out of the cab and went back to fasten the tailgate. As he did so, everything just went topsy-turvy for 19 seconds, and we're going to count them off right here. It's a long time, isn't it? "19 seconds has just passed, and when Santa Barbarans stepped outside of their houses, this is what greeted them. This is the 300 block of State Street, which currently doesn't exist because it's mostly Highway 101, but this is what it looked like as the people walked out of their houses. Looking up from Haley Street, there's some more damage. Unfortunately, we're missing this one little piece here, which I really like. This guy here, carnation in his lapel. Didn't I say that Santa Barbans look good no matter what the occasion? Only in the middle of a disaster would we dare to come out dressed sharply with hat and carnation on our lapels. And then heading up to State and De La Guerra, we're looking down. This is the corner where Starbucks is, or depending on what you remember, Anderson's Camera used to be there. And what I also like about this shot is this is the Rexall store at the corner of State and De La Guerra. X-Lax. And many people have told me there's one thing you didn't need in Santa Barbara that morning. That was X-Lax. I can only tell the truth that people have told me. Well, we had an earthquake. Now, they didn't have the Richter scale back then. It still hadn't been invented, but there were devices to measure earthquakes. And most importantly for us, the gas company had a temperature gauge in their building, and the needle was shaken by the earthquake. So here's this little jolt that we talked about at 3:30 in the morning up there, which ain't much. Then we come down here to about 6:42 a.m. And it all depends on who's watched and who was looking at it. Somewhere between 6:41 and 6:44, so I'm kind of meeting at 6:42, 6:43. We had this earthquake, and they estimated this earthquake to be about 6.3 on the Richter scale. And here's all the aftershocks coming along there. So, what did we do about this earthquake? Well, for one, we lost our telegraph and telephone poles. They fell down, wires were broken. Sheffield Dam broke. 40 million gallons of water headed down Sycamore Canyon and down to the Lower East Side, creating a nice big lake for a while down along there. And the only fatalities from the Sheffield Dam collapse, and I forget the farmer's name, it might be Cozini or something like that, he lost 11 or 12 cows that were swept out to sea, the first fatalities of this earthquake. We can see the roadway, the state highway leading out of Santa Barbara, the huge cracks and fissures that developed along there. And also, down along our beachfront, here's the street railway. The earthquake was so strong, it ripped the rails. And you know how thick these rails are, ripped them right in half. Up at the Mission, a miraculous escape at the old Mission. As the earthquake struck, Father Hobrecht, up in the choir loft, could hear the towers above him crumbling and see things starting to come down and shake. As the prisoners started running to the front door, he yelled down to them, "Stay in the building, don't go outside." And so everybody sort of sat and waited for the whole thing to rock and finally stop. So trying to get out of the choir loft, there was another problem. The door was blocked, and so they put their shoulders to it and finally broke the door open. Now, this is what they were headed to above the archways, heading down to the far side of the Mission. This is what the hallway looked like just before the earthquake. And this is what it looked like after the earthquake. And all the adobe had crumbled down, and there was dust and everything from plaster and adobe up in the air, and they could barely see the dim light at the far end. And first, Brother Erasmus was ahead of Father Hobrecht, and as he was inching forward, Father Hobrecht heard him cry, and then I heard a big thud. And a few seconds later, Father Hobrecht went down and went thud. And they didn't know what had happened. He looked around, he finally saw a light from above him and beside him, and realized that between that hallway and himself, the floor had given in, and so Father Hobrecht and Brother Erasmus just went straight down to the bottom of the first floor there. Luckily, they were unhurt, and they were able to get out of the building and stand outside. And this is what they saw when they got outside. So here's the towers had collapsed. Had the prisoners run out that front door, they just would have been covered in debris as it's cascaded down from the bell towers. Father Hobrecht remembered, as they looked up at the towers, another slight earthquake came through, another aftershock, and he said he could hear the bells start to sway and then ring these long, mournful tones as nature rang the bells for like the final time for over a year, because they had to close the Mission down. Well, just then a messenger came from St. Anthony's and said, "Father Hobrecht, there's a problem up here, come quickly." And John Shea, the gardener up at St. Anthony's, had been struck when some of the sandstone came off the top of the building and hit his shoulder and hit his head. And so Father Hobrecht gave him the last rites, and John Shea passed away, the first fatality of the Santa Barbara earthquake. Heading down to the Arlington, death checks into the Arlington. And Annie Dahlgren, my lovely wife, made all these neat things for me with the little characters and stuff, so I hope we all enjoy these. So, death checks into the Arlington. Well, Vandella Pearson, Mrs. Perkins' maid, her mistress called out to her as soon as the earthquake struck, and she rushed to the door and pulled it open, and as she did so, she said it was like a freight train passed right past her. She opened the door, and the entire tower collapsed before her eyes, and this was her door right about there. You can see it's jarred open. The force threw the door back and threw her back in her room as she saw her mistress and all this stuff just cascade down right past her. Inside, up on the third floor, Alan Hancock and Joe Chapman were up there, and they were thrown down and dumped down below here. Alan Hancock got pierced by a piece of steel, and I think his leg got crushed. Chapman was okay. And a busboy and a dining room maid were also huddled down there, and they got down to the lawn to safety. And as Hancock looked up back at the tower area, he realized there was absolutely no hope his son Bertram could be alive. Immediately, rescuers piled in. I mean, people came out of nowhere and started running into the Arlington, and here they are climbing up trying to find Mrs. Perkins and Alan Hancock, but they were goners. Mrs. Perkins was 92 years old, and here's a picture of what she looks like, number 2 in our death count today. Bertram Hancock was just a young 22 years old, just starting off in life, and I think he was the only child of the Hancocks. And for those of you who may know, up in Santa Maria, there's Allen Hancock College, so that's the father. He donated that college and the land. So Bertram Hancock and Mrs. Perkins, numbers 2 and 3. A block away at the San Marcos building, it was a struggle, life and death at the San Marcos building. Well, when the earthquake struck, as we talked about, it was sort of going on an east to west roll. And the San Marcos building here at the corner of State and Anapamu Street, as the earthquake came through from east to west, it just started rolling it like this. And so these two sides just ground against each other and then collapsed. How many people were in the building? They weren't sure. Dr. Engel's car was in front. Was his nurse in there with him? Was there a patient with him? Rumors were flying. Somebody remembered, oh yeah, Sigismundo Mostero, the building janitor. He must have been here. He turns on the boilers in the morning. Who else could have possibly been there? Within due time, over 100 people had assembled at the San Marcos building. Out of nowhere, steam shovels and trucks appeared to start piling through the debris. And I also like this. This is the mortuary. It's either an ambulance or a hearse. It doubled for both. So if somebody was alive, they took care of them, and if somebody wasn't, they took care of them. So it almost looks like a vulture sitting there waiting for something to happen. Well, unbeknownst to the workers, there was life in the rubble below them, and they couldn't hear it. And finally, one of the men heard a faint noise, and so they said, turn off the tractors, turn off the generators. And down below was a maid, Mrs. Santiago Villamor. And she had been up on the 4th floor. She was a janitress when the building collapsed. She went down, and luckily some framework crossed above her and protected her, and her legs were pinned. She was trapped. For 6 hours, she lapsed in and out of consciousness and tried to raise her voice, and they could barely hear her. Finally, they heard her cries. They dug her out, and after 6 hours of being imprisoned in the plaster of the San Marcos building, they pulled her out alive with just some minor leg wounds and got her up to Cottage Hospital. Not so fortunate was Dr. Engel. Around 5 o'clock on June 29th, they found his hand sticking out from the rubble and pulled him out. And then it took 2 more days to get down to the basement where the janitor, Sigismundo Mostero, lay buried and crushed down below. Now, there was 2 lawsuits that came out of this. I haven't seen too much in the line of earthquake lawsuits. The first lawsuit actually was 2 young women who hired a plane from Los Angeles to come to Santa Barbara and take a look around and see if they could find their friends. Upon returning to Los Angeles, the plane crashed, and so one of the women got a broken thumb and the other one got some bruises, and so they decided to sue the airplane company for their tragic injuries. The family of Sigismundo Mostero sued the Hawley family that owned the San Marcos building, and also Dr. Engel's wife, Emily, sued. Now, I don't know if Dr. Engel ever knew it or not, but his wife was pregnant, and I have one account that says the baby was born 9 months later. And so I thought it's possible he never knew his wife was pregnant, and he was heading down to Pasadena, so perhaps the big surprise was going to be given to him at his wife's home, or his wife's parents' home down there. Later articles said that the child was born 3 months after the event, but I'm pretty sure it happened 9 months after the event. So Mrs. Engel sued the Hawley family for $500,000. The first trial, which finally took place in 1926, had a mistrial because a juror let it be known that he and a few other people could be bribed if necessary to change the outcome of the trial. So there's a mistrial. Now, the second trial also ended in a mistrial because one of the jurors sitting in the jury box was sitting reading a New York newspaper account of the earthquake. And they said, I don't think so. Would you like to take a guess to who that juror was? Pearl Chase. I've had some complaints over the last couple of months that I've never mentioned Pearl Chase in my slideshow, so I've mentioned her today twice now, so that should make up for it. Meanwhile, down the street, here's Carl Sylvester, the driver for the Santa Barbara Meat Market, and he's happily posing on his car where, had he not had that tailgate latch problem, he would have been sitting in the cab when that huge block dropped off the top of the Bonton Market. There is another incident similar to this, and we'll call this the cigarette that saved a life. And it's either one of the Giordano's or the Casagnolas. I've got, you know how stories are. Somebody hears a story and somebody then says, well, it happened to me. So it's either a Giordano or a Casagnola. Was about to enter this narrow alleyway called Caesar's Alley that led from State Street over to De La Guerra Plaza. and that's before the wide placita that we have now. This was just a little narrow alleyway. And the guy stopped to light a cigarette. As he did so, the match went out, and he swore lightly and then pulled out another match and lit the cigarette. And just before he entered the alleyway, the earthquake struck, knocked him to his feet. So as he said, had he not stopped to light that cigarette and the match gone out, he would have been in the middle of that alleyway and been killed when the building collapsed. So therefore, that cigarette saved that man's life. Jumping into De La Guerra Plaza, it is amazing how this community came together. First, people checked on their families, checked on their homes, and then everybody headed downtown. By 9 o'clock, all the city department heads had reported for work. By 8 o'clock, just about an hour after the earthquake, the American Legion and the Red Cross both had canteens established in De La Guerra Plaza, providing refreshments and coffee for the rescuers who were out searching for survivors. The Boy Scouts arrived and started running messages back and forth to all the workers and what was going on, providing communications. The Girl Scouts pitched in too. And eventually the Army and the police and everybody had tents and little businesses going in De La Guerra Plaza. It was the place to go. And I also enjoy it that these two kids here, in the middle of all this, are throwing a baseball back and forth. So De La Guerra Plaza was the center of everything happening in Santa Barbara, the command central, as it were. And there was a Red Cross canteen at the public library, and here they are up here. There was one on the front lawn of the Arlington. And also, I enjoyed reading the newspaper article because it said, for our foreign-speaking residents, the Red Cross had opened a canteen down at Veracruz Park between Haley and Coda Street. So the Red Cross was running 4 or 5 canteens with donuts, coffee, food, anything you needed, blankets to help people get going. Oh, communication with the outside world. Phone lines were down. They were destroyed. And not only that, but the phone building itself was destroyed, so even if the phone lines hadn't been down, there was no switchboard to go to. Rumors were running around. Los Angeles was in flames. San Francisco was destroyed. Nobody knew how big this earthquake was. Well, there was a young man named Brandy Wentworth that was up at a friend of his house in Mission Canyon, and so they headed downtown to see what was going on. And they passed the Western Union Telegraph Office and saw that was messed up. They went by the other telegraph office, which I forget the name of it, but the Western Union, whatever the other second telegraph company was, and they were out of commission. Well, I think in what constitutes the first act of looting, they broke into the Bolton and Jones appliance store on the 800 block of State Street and pulled out an RCA radio. And Brandy Wentworth and his friends were ham radio enthusiasts. And so they got together a few odds and ends. They went to a friend's house, Bernie Lopez, over on Santa Barbara Street. He was gone, but he had ham equipment. And so they started to build. They got some batteries from an old Model T and a coil. They ran a ground wire to the streetcar tracks. Somebody climbed the antenna pole over at Bolton and Jones and put up an antenna. And he started trying to find radio stations. First thing he found was radio station KFI down in Los Angeles, broadcasting as if nothing had happened. So they knew Los Angeles was okay, so that rumor was being quashed really quickly. A huge crowd started gathering by now because these kids had communication. And then Brandy sent out an SOS. It said, SOS de Santa Barbara, and sent it out. He said it was a frequency about as wide as a barn and as far as he could get it to go. And finally, a oil tanker out in the channel radioed back and said, what? And he said, SOS Santa Barbara. And then he clicked back saying, earthquake, lives unknown, or loss unknown, blah, blah, blah. And the Chevron oil tanker said, well, we can't come in, we're too big. But they radioed a salvage tug that was heading down the coast, the Peacock. And so the Peacock tug then arrived at Santa Barbara around noon and tied up at Stearns Wharf. And then the first radio broadcast came out of the Peacock. The mayor went down there and broadcast, for all ships and stations, Santa Barbara has suffered a severe earthquake shock, started at 6:40 a.m. and lasted for about 2 hours. Principal damage is State Street, main business street, almost every business block is damaged. He mentioned that there's only been a few fatalities and a few injuries. Gibraltar Dam is okay. Sheffield Reservoir has emptied. But the Red Cross is in active charge and has established headquarters and is here to care for and feed for the needy. No call is sent out for help, as it is believed the city can fend for itself. The property loss is very large, but the city will rebuild bigger and better than before. Sam Andrea, Mayor. I think it's kind of interesting that they said, don't send help. But everybody did. San Francisco sent down trainloads of doctors and nurses, and they got here and they said, we don't need you. Go back home. And not only that, but there's no place to stay. All the hotels are demolished. St. Francis Hospital was demolished. Cottage Hospital was functioning somewhat. So we really didn't need all that help, but everybody kept trying to help us, whether we needed it or not. Another shot of the Brandy Wentworth story here. This is a staged photograph later on because these guys, the sailors, didn't arrive until Tuesday. So this was set up. And also, we have a new character in our story. This is Archie Banks. And some of you may remember Banks Stationery on State Street. And Archie Banks told the story that he had set up the communications table and then turned it over to these 2 young kids. Brandy Wentworth and his friends remember their side of the story, that they gathered all the equipment and brought it and set it up. So there's always been 2 sides to the story. And I don't want to take sides in this because some of you may be friends of Brandy Wentworth, some may be friend of Archie Banks. So, one thing though, this radio set that sent out the first and received the first signal for Santa Barbara's help was given by Bolton & Jones to the City Hall as a historical souvenir. And I wonder where that radio is today as we approach the 80th anniversary of the earthquake. So we'll see if we can dig that one up. Well, we now had contact with the outside world, but what about communication with the inside world? What was happening in Santa Barbara? Again, rumors were running back and forth. Well, leave it to Tom Stork to get the first newspaper out in Santa Barbara. The Daily News building actually survived the earthquake rather well. But despite all his employees, here they are showing up. All the employees show up for work despite the earthquake. He didn't let them in the building until engineers had checked it out and made sure it was okay. So Stork, using a hand press at first, put out this first edition of the paper. And I love it that under all this pressure of the earthquake, setting type by hand, using a hand crank press, he had time to write an editorial, had time to give you the instructions. Who'd ever had an earthquake before, but Tom Stork already had instructions for you what to do because of an earthquake. And a few things about rumors that were false. So the first paper came out blank on one side and disinformation on the other. A second edition came out with 2 sides printed, and this time they had a generator from Otts, so they had some power for a small printing press. And what I like about the second edition is, despite all the news and all the things happening with the earthquake, he took the time to give us important earth-shattering news from elsewhere around America. From Detroit, night plowing can now be easily done with a new type of tractor which is equipped with a powerful searchlight. Important news for us to know here in Santa Barbara. In Australia, 2 small boys caught a bunch of fish by putting a bottle in the water with bread inside, and this fish swam inside, and so they caught 16 fish. This he saw as big news. In the third edition, he figured it's about time he made some money, so the back page of the third edition has advertising on it as if nothing had happened. A few bankruptcy notices, a city council hearing. So Tom Stork hit us up with our first bit of news. The grand opening of the Hotel California. The hotel had just barely opened when the earthquake struck, and we can see what happens when you have these wooden framed buildings with the exterior that is not tied to the building. Wood gives way and sways back and forth, and it just blew all those bricks right off the side as it started moving. And people had a hard time getting out of the building. One guy remembers, well, he just went running through the front doors down here. At the same time, he remembers a man and his daughter running like crazy and diving through the broken window over here, even though the front door was wide open. Out in the street, there was a rather portly man in his pajamas running around the circle screaming, "A taxi! A taxi! Where is my taxi?" And one of the other problems that people had was getting out of the hotel because their doors were stuck. And so they tied blankets together and crawled out and dropped from floor to floor. And the California Hotel was probably one of the most popular photographed wrecks of the earthquake because it just looked like a honeycomb, the way the walls just peeled off the sides. And here's a close-up of one of the rooms, and I love it. Here's an earthquake which has just knocked the sides off this building, and there's the chair and the table sitting as if absolutely nothing had happened at all. And a radiator sits there. This bed is kind of the cattywampus there, but it's still sitting there, hadn't fallen out. And there are some blankets tied together where the guys got out of it. So, but there was no loss of life at the California. Amazing enough, everybody got out safely from there. The media frenzy. Well, it is not so important to report the news correctly as it is to be the first to report the news. And so, actually, although we thought no one knew what had happened, California was well aware of an earthquake in Santa Barbara. As soon as the telegraph lines went down, the telegraph operators found out they had no communication. They figured somewhere in Santa Barbara County something had happened. Also, the last train came through Santa Barbara just about 6:43, and so they felt the shaking of it on the tracks. The last bus, the Pickwick bus, left Santa Barbara at 6:42, and the people on board saw the city collapsing behind them. So by the time they got to Ventura and Los Angeles, they started spreading the word. There was an earthquake there. By 10 o'clock, the first airplanes appeared over Santa Barbara. In the meantime, the press was also sending cars at high speed racing through California to get here, to get the stories, get the pictures, and get back. But the bigger newspapers had airplanes come right over the city and start taking pictures. So there's the Hotel California at State and Mason, the train station, the Neo Hotel. Now, you may think that I put this slide in backwards because it says photo taken from airplane backwards up there. It's actually Otapa Fonucan Morph Agrilia. But actually, they were in such a hurry to print this picture, they didn't care that it was backwards or not. So when I first saw this, I kept thinking, where is this on State Street? I can't figure this out. Then I realized, oh, they reversed the picture. So here's the clock building at the corner of State and Carrillo, De La Guerra Plaza down there, the News Press building, but they printed it backwards in their haste to get the story out. Well, media frenzy is certainly exemplified here by the San Francisco Call Bulletin paper. Quake, fire, 65 die in Santa Barbara. Huge wall of water sweeps from sea over stricken city. And if you go on to read it, the city is in flames. It's in ruins. We are destitute. Who knows what's happened? Well, the San Francisco Examiner was a little more restrained. They said 12 were killed, 155 injured, and they, without even being here, gave us a $5 million loss in the quake. The next day, the San Francisco Call Bulletin was a little more restrained. They now said 13 were dead, 2 listed as missing. What happened to those other 50 people? They didn't explain where they vanished to, but the death count was a lot lower. But now they added 200 orphans dodged death as temblors wrecked gymnasium. Well, that was about the St. Vincent's Orphanage over on San Marcos Pass, Calle Real area. And actually what had happened was the kids were not in the gym. The story goes on that had the kids been in the gym when the earthquake struck, all the lockers fell over, the roof caved in, they would have been killed. Well, they weren't near the gym, but the headline sounds really great, so they just went with the headline because it told the story really well. And then we have another newspaper that tells us here that guards redoubled as looters raid quake-wrecked stores. There was no looting. There was maybe a half a dozen incidents I've seen where people, generally drunks, were taking something out of a house or did something and they were well known to the cops and got arrested, so it wasn't that big of a deal. This particular story had a piece in there about the Cathedral of Our Lady of Guadalupe that was robbed of priceless vestments and antique and rich gold and silver chalices and other altar pieces. Well, as the story, somebody figured out, well, there's no Cathedral of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And they did a little investigation, and the story has its roots in a milkman who went up to the parish hall and picked up a bunch of milk bottles, and put it in his truck and drove away. And from that, this story grew about vestments being stolen. I think Newsweek magazine must have put the story out first. Well, there's also movies made. This is a man named Roy Klafke, and he was a flying A motion picture cameraman during the teens and then went down to Hollywood. But he was here in 1925 to film the Santa Barbara earthquake. Bob Phelan was another flying A motion picture guy. He was in Santa Barbara and did the newsreels that were shown at the Granada Theater. And so Bob Phelan took motion pictures with his camera. Also, we saw the airplanes coming over. They dropped off cameramen. They took pictures. The day after the earthquake in Los Angeles, you could go to the movies, and as part of the newsreel, it had the Santa Barbara earthquake story there on film for you. And some of these films have survived. If you watched KEYT News last night, they showed some of the film of the Santa Barbara earthquake, and I don't know which photographer took that. Also, City TV, Channel 18, every so often will show the motion picture of the Santa Barbara earthquake. So I don't know who the photographer was, but you can choose from any number of guys who were out there with their cameras snapping the pictures away. As far as patrolling the streets, immediately the American Legion and the Naval Reserve assembled, and without any really authority or anybody telling them to do so, these guys grabbed their World War I weapons and ammunition belts and started patrolling State Street. The city police had no problem at all because they had a small police force, but they had so many volunteers showing up, plus the Naval Reserve and the American Legion. Santa Barbara had a home guard of about 400 people that first day patrolling the streets and making sure nothing happened. And nothing really did happen. Everybody behaved quite well. Well, on early Tuesday morning, the USS Arkansas, a battleship, which was sent by President Coolidge to Santa Barbara, they arrived and unloaded a bunch of sailors and communications equipment and doctors and nurses, which went up to Cottage Hospital. There's a few stories that say the battleship anchored off Stearns Wharf, so I investigated it because I thought, this is a big boat. And Stearns Wharf isn't that far out to sea, and so because I am so detail-oriented, I figured out what the draft of this boat was and how high stern's warp was at high and low tides, and found out that the battleship could not have possibly have tied up at stern's warp. But in addition to the Arkansas, there was also 2 destroyers that came, 2 Coast Guard cutters, 3 Navy tugboats, like a PT boat, an Eagle boat. There were so many ships offshore, and I have yet to see a picture showing any of these boats that are off the shore there. So if anybody has one, let me know. So here's some of the sailors unloaded off the Arkansas patrolling the streets, and they just look like they're puppies. This guy can be barely more than 10 minutes old, walking around there carrying the rifles, patrolling the streets. Well, because Santa Barbara already had so many people patrolling the streets, the commander of the Arkansas, once they unloaded all the supplies and spent the day patrolling the streets, they took most of their sailors back. They left us with their doctors and nurses, and plus we had the Coast Guard cutters and the destroyers here, so they figured it was time to go, so the Arkansas left. But then on July 1st, on Thursday, or Wednesday, whichever day July 1st turned out to be, the Marines arrived. 200 Marines came up from Camp Pendleton, got off at the train station, and much to the delight of the Santa Barbans that were watching, they double-timed it all the way up State Street with their packs and with their rifles, and headed to Peabody Stadium, where the quartermasters had set up the Marine Corps camp at the brand-new Peabody Stadium of the high school. Now, when the Marines arrived, things were a little bit different as far as patrolling the streets went. Prior to this time, you weren't supposed to drive your car through the quake zones or go across State Street or anything else. But as you approached the home guard guy who you probably knew, and he'd say, oh, you can't cross the street, and people told me that when you let out the clutch, and you kind of let the car roll, and they would walk back talking to you saying, well, no, you're not supposed to, well, you're halfway across the street, keep on going, what the heck. Well, when the Marines took over, it was serious business, and when you approached the intersection, they had their bayonets at the ready, so if you let off on the clutch and started going forward, you'd impale yourself on a bayonet. So law and order prevailed while the Marines were here. And of course, also while the Marines were here, no woman was safe because they started picking up on the local girls first thing off. It's something about a man in uniform that women just seem to love. Well, as long as we got these 2 lovebirds hanging out in the corner of State and Figueroa, here's the Our Lady of Sorrows Church. And we can see that it reverted back to its original adobe shape. All the bricks dropped off, the bell towers collapsed, and you can see those big heavy beams inside here that I talked about that were holding this whole thing together. But because it wasn't tied into anything, everything just rocked back and forth, and that thing is just beautifully balanced up there hanging along. Well, it wasn't just the Catholics. The Unitarians got hammered. This is the church that we saw at the corner of Arlington Avenue and State Street. So they took a beating. And the Trinity Episcopal Church, just across the street, or just up the street here at State and Mitchell-Terena, the congregation had just paid off the note. This church was built in 1912. They had just paid it off when all this damage happened. And I was talking to some survivors about this, going through earthquake photographs one time, and I mentioned, you know, I've got the Episcopalian Church, I got the Presbyterian Church, I got the Congregationalist Church, and I mentioned something about the Christian Science Church. I had no pictures of it, and one of the women said, it probably healed itself. Well, just to show that there is no separation between church and state as far as the Almighty is concerned, he also took care of the county courthouse and the Hall of Records. And that was perfect because we needed a new courthouse anyway, but they didn't have the money to do it. So thanks to the earthquake, the courthouse was demolished and the Hall of Records demolished, so then we had to get the new beautiful courthouse we'd eventually end up with. Behind the courthouse was the jail. And the jail sort of wall came out. Here's the toilets. So you can see the floor tilted and prisoners got to tumble out to the lawn below. Well, nobody escaped because where were they going to go? So they just sat there in the courthouse lawn kind of looking around, and the worst ones were taken down to Ventura. I think 4 or 5 were taken to Ventura and put in jail down there, and the rest were told, why don't you go work on some of the rescue things and help out with stuff and come back when it's all over. And everybody was on their best behavior, and they did. We talk about fortunate things that happened during a disaster. It's kind of odd, as we have seen people die and stuff, to say that this was a fortunate thing. Well, there was some fortunate things that happened. This is the Southern California Edison building at where Pershing Park currently is, and at the corner of Mason Street here and Castillo Street. And as the earthquake struck, inside was the night engineer, a man named William Engel. And it says here, awake at the switch, because he ran through the building. As it started disintegrating around him, he was being struck by pieces falling here and there, and still he ran to the far side of the building, pulled the switch, which cut off the electricity for Santa Barbara. And here's the Edison company after the earthquake that Engel had been running through. And on the other side of town at Quarantina Street was the Southern California Gas Company. And inside there was a man named Henry Ferdinand Ketz. He was inside, and despite orders from his superiors that no one is to ever turn off the gas to Santa Barbara without calling your boss, he realized the situation, and again, dodging debris, he ran into the gas building and turned off the gas for Santa Barbara. Because of these guys' bravery in doing this, Santa Barbara did not catch fire. And this is unusual. Think about 1906, the San Francisco earthquake. Most of the damage was not the earthquake. It was the fire that destroyed the city. The same thing in 1922-23, the Yokohama disaster in Japan. Fire destroyed everything. For once, seismologists and engineers had a virgin landscape, so to speak. They could study the city and see what the effects of earthquakes were on cement, brick, what had happened, poor construction. It was all there for them to look at and see the true effects of an earthquake without the fire damage. Well, Engels got to go back east and talk to be introduced at the big Edison Company convention and conference and got a big cash reward. Mr. Ketz got a nice gold watch. I've found Mr. Ketz's family. I got a picture of the watch and some of the certificates that he got, and I've been trying to find Engels' family, and I have traced them, I think, to Ventura, but I haven't heard back yet to see if they're the right people or not. So there's the people that saved Santa Barbara. And of course, this is from the Brick Company. Building Economy is their little trade magazine, and at the bottom it says, Lessons Learned from Santa Barbara. Every type of construction company, brick, tile, wood, etc., published things like this in which they took, like the Brick Company, showed pictures of brick buildings that survived the earthquake. They ignored all the brick buildings that were completely demolished and instead put pictures of the hollow tile buildings, the wood buildings, the concrete buildings, saying brick is the best. The concrete people did the same thing. All these brick buildings went down. Oh, this building went down. Concrete. There is a man's trade right there. Concrete. So everybody promoted their own type of stuff. And none did it better than the builders of the Granada building, which put a huge poster up here at the top that says, Build with quake-resisting gunite, the LA Cement Company. Now, this is the ocean-facing side of the Granada, and so there was some damage, all these cracks, which they've chiseled out and opened up. Now, if you go by the Granada today, if you look on the Mission side or the upper side of the Granada, there's 5 windows like there are here. On the south side, they filled all of these in to strengthen the building. So the Granada did take a little bit of a hit and took some weaknesses, but they reinforced it and strengthened it all up. Not so fortunate. We mentioned how things are fortunate. Well, there was some unfortunate occasions, especially if you were one of the people that died. And we mentioned a few people that have been killed so far. Well, I started trying to find out exactly who died, because the stories are 12 died, 13 died, 15 died. So I went through all the newspapers I could find, found all the reasons people died, all the places and what their occupations were, and their names. And I started off with a list of 65 different names, which I then started figuring out they were misspellings. Like here's a Mienastida Mera Nina Ninamuna. Then it was Mrs. Maranimana Ministero, Mama Mina Ministido, Ministido Maramia, onward and onward. And as it turned out, the actual real name was an alias because this guy was an escaped convict from Mexico. And if you go to Calvary Cemetery, I found 3 people there. Merced Leon, who was a Santa Barbara guy, and a guy named Gerard Chavez, and then Cecilio Gomez. Cecilio Gomez was this guy's real name. And at Calvary Cemetery, the records there have Ministido, whatever his name was, and Chavez, which are the same guy, in 2 graves. So one of these guys got ripped off. His name has never been associated with the grave. But we've been working with Santa Barbara Monumental, and hopefully by the end of the month, we're going to have headstones for these 3 Mexican guys who were pretty much unknown and buried in Santa Barbara at Calvary Cemetery. So we're going to have headstones for them. Another guy that we found was William Proctor. His name was listed a million different ways, but I found out his name was actually William Hilton Proctor, and I just found his son, who's still alive, up in Woodland, California. He had no idea about his dad. He was 8 years old when it happened, remembered the earthquake. His brother, who had identified the body at the coroner's office, had just died 2 years ago, so I just missed talking to him. Unfortunately, they have no picture of him because the brother's house got broken into many years back and everything was stolen. But we're getting ahead. He's at Santa Barbara Cemetery. We're getting a headstone for him. This gentleman up here, R.M. Litchfield, it says he's a retired wealthy merchant. Well, I found Richfield's family also in Northern California, and I wrote to them and found out that the nieces and nephews were still alive, and they remembered the stories of Uncle Ralph, and so they found this picture for me. It turns out that Uncle Ralph was neither retired nor was he wealthy. He worked for the Shell Oil Company, and he was in his late 20s. He was here in Santa Barbara that day to scout out new locations for Shell Oil gas stations in Santa Barbara. And he's posed here beside his beautiful Model T, and that's the only clip that we have of him. And this is where he met his end. And this is a picture taken from an airplane, obviously, the day of the earthquake. And what really shows up neat is how buildings rubbed against each other and things crashed, and when the whole front of the building came out and how it just landed perfectly in the street below, like the whole front just peeled off and dropped. Unfortunately, Mr. Litchfield was right there when all that dropped and landed on him. He was either in the Brown Mug Cafe on State Street when it happened, or he was upstairs at the Grand Hotel and ran out when all this dropped on him. And there's a Model T Ford there and a Model T there, and I don't know which one belonged to Mr. Litchfield. They found him early Tuesday morning when they saw a police officer saw a boot sticking out of the rubble, and they'd noticed it before but just thought it was some of the clothing that had emptied out of the hotel above. And so somebody pulled on the boot and realized there was a foot attached to it, and so that belonged to Mr. Litchfield. Or Mr. Litchfield. So he was sent back up north to be buried in the cemetery at his family plot. Well, there were some interesting deaths that happened, and this is the amazing death and resurrection of Haphazard. When the first newspaper came out with a list of the dead, Santa Barbans were tragic to read H. Hazard among the dead. Haphazard was a legend in Santa Barbara. He'd opened a bicycle shop in 1914. He built, designed, and raced speedboats, sold outboard motors, and he could fix and build just about anything. And as the other Southern Californians picked up the story, people down south were also just horrified to hear of the death of Haphazard. But no one was more surprised to read of the death of Haphazard than Haphazard himself. And when he saw the story, he went to the mirror and looked at it and thought he looked all right as far as he was concerned. So the next day he headed down to the morning press so that they could appraise his personage and see if they too thought he was okay. So they looked him over and said, "You look all right to us." So Hap sat down with the boys at the morning press and said, "Well, boys, I'll tell you, it does not pay to take off your jacket in Santa Barbara." It seems that the morning of the earthquake, Hap came across a demolished building and started rushing in to help look for survivors, took off his jacket and set it aside. As he shoveled and worked, dust and debris started raining on his jacket, and by the end of the day, it had fallen down and been covered with rubble as people dug and searched and looked for things. And so Hap went home forgetting about his jacket. Well, somebody came along and saw this jacket kind of sticking out of the rubble, pulled it out, and it was all dust covered, and found the identification, Haphazard. He's crushed inside. And so Haphazard, the coat was taken to the police station, identified as Hap's, and he was dead. But luckily, Haphazard continued to live for another 40 years to astound, amaze, and awe Santa Barbarans. Souvenirs. Well, this was a grand opportunity. Everybody seems to love a disaster. As soon as people could get through the police blockades, they started arriving in Santa Barbara and getting their pictures taken in front of the ruins of Santa Barbara. They enjoyed standing with some of the, this is maybe Ralph Litchfield's Model T down on State Street. So here's a bunch of people standing out in front of the car in front of this disaster. And there was also this pair. They produced their own postcards, and they're posed all through Santa Barbara on all kinds of disastrous things. They had about a dozen postcards in their collection. And there was also souvenirs. You could buy all these different souvenir pamphlets that were put out. And the Chamber of Commerce, when this first one came out here, the Chamber of Commerce was rather upset about the whole thing, saying, this is a disaster. People are going to know about Santa Barbara. But the business people are figuring, hey, they're here taking pictures of our city. This is a tourist. This is a godsend. People are coming here. Let's sell them this stuff and get it going. And one of the great souvenir things was postcards. Dwight Faulding, a man named Edwin Rick were two of the big people producing postcards, and my friend Brian Bird has done a lot of research on the Santa Barbara postcards and pretty much figured that it was Edwin Rick who did the bulk of the postcards. And for those of us who collect and chase down these postcards, we can look at this rack here and figure out exactly which postcard and which building are being sold up there. And I think this isn't Edwin Rick. I think this is his nephew or some other relation. I forget. Brian? Okay, and I've got this guy selling the postcards and other things, so he was some sort of relation, or? So it's Edwin Rick, and there's his postcard thing right out in front of the California Hotel. Well, there was something else that came out. There was a great hit song that hit the records. This is the Columbia 78, the Santa Barbara Earthquake song. And not only could you get it on a 78 RPM record, but you could also buy the piano roll for your piano player. And here it is, the Santa Barbara Earthquake player piano roll. Now, I don't have a Victrola up here to play the music for you, and I don't got a player piano to play the music for you, but we do have Peter Feldman, who knows all about the Santa Barbara Earthquake song, who wrote it, how it happened, and he also knows how to sing and play this song. And so Peter Feldman is going to join us along with David West and give us the Santa Barbara Earthquake song.
Thank you, Neil, for inviting me to come down and add some music to your very interesting talk.
Thank you, Peter.
The song you're going to hear is part of an old tradition in country music, which was involved writing songs about current events as well as romantic triangles and things like that. There were lots of songs, for example, about train wrecks. The old 97, the wreck of the 31, the engine 143, the wreck of the 1262, etc. It goes on and on. The trains were always getting wrecked. Earthquakes were a little bit rarer, but when the 25 earthquake hit, one of the country's top songwriters, his name was Carson Robeson, quickly put a song together, although he didn't know really where Santa Barbara was outside of the fact that it was in California. He read the newspaper accounts, and he quickly got the song to a very famous singer of his day. His name was Vernon Dalhart. Well, that's the name he used on this particular record. Vernon Dalhart's real name was Marion Try Slaughter. He came from Texas, a little town in Texas, and took that particular pseudonym from the names of two Texas towns, Vernon, Texas, and Dalhart, Texas, between which his little town was located. He used about 233 other pseudonyms when he recorded, because he had exclusive contracts with dozens of record labels. That's how you got an exclusive contract. You just made up a new name and started putting out records. And he may be the most prolific recording artist ever. People are still trying to track down all the titles that he recorded. I think there are now more than 5,000 titles that he sang. He was a light opera singer at first, but he soon realized that he could make a lot of money making the new popular records, which started to be issued in country music at least in 23, 24, and 25. So here's the Santa Barbara Earthquake. It's sort of a formula song, talks about the disaster, and has an ending with a moralistic tone to the end of it so that everybody could be happy with some sort of an outcome. Way out in California, upon the hills so tall, stood the town of Santa Barbara that they thought would never fall. But on one fatal morning, before the break of day, while the people they were sleeping, the hills began to sway. When daylight found the people with a sad and aching heart, they were searching for their loved ones that the earthquake tore apart. But some of them were sleeping beneath the fallen stone. Their lips were sealed forever, never more It's just another warning from God up in the sky. A warning, all you good people, that he still remains on high. Now we do not know the moment when he shall call us home, but we should all be ready before our time has come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Neil. Visit us at bluegrasswest.com on the web. Take care.
That was great. I have the Victrola at home. It never sounded that good or that clear. So this is about the first time in 80 years that an audience has heard that song. So we're very fortunate to hear that one. But let's move on. Well, we talked about the businesses, State Street and things like that. What about residential? About 90% of the houses in Santa Barbara suffered some sort of damage. The average damage to a house was $100. Not much happened. This is an extreme condition where an adobe/wood house ripped in half, and of course it was a great thing for people to take a picture of. They love this one. Another type of thing that happened was many houses were rocked or walked off their foundations. You can see the chimney is over here, and that's where the house is over there. And so that's why you're supposed to tie your house to the foundation. Another piece of major damage to some of the homes was the chimneys falling and crashing through. And as we heard the man talking last night on KEYT, that the chimney broke and fell through the roof, and his father had pulled him out of his crib just before the chimney came crashing through. In fact, exactly 1 year to the day after the earthquake, June 29, 1926, a slight earthquake struck, and a chimney fell off a house and hit a young kid and killed him. So one fatality for that year. Most Santa Barbans camped out in their backyards or front yards, and I've heard a lot of you today telling me you remember camping out there. And I kind of like this because compared to the Northridge earthquake down in Los Angeles, which teams of psychiatrists and psychologists were rushed to the city to help the traumatized children recover, so many kids of Santa Barbara just say, it was great. We got donuts in the De La Guerra Plaza. We ran messages. We camped in the backyard all summer. So for the kids, it was kind of a fun time. For the parents, it might not have been. A gentleman named Tom Rohrbeck sent me this picture of his mother cooking in the backyard. They cooked pretty much for the summer, though, even though gas and electricity was back on within 2 weeks. Because of the aftershocks, they thought it was a bad idea to be inside the houses, so people sort of hung out in their backyards. And pretty soon as the year continued, things went back to normal. As far as the old mission went, it became a symbol of the rebuilding of Santa Barbara. And to rebuild the mission, everybody gave. It was not seen as a Catholic church. It was seen as a symbol of California and a symbol of history. So people of all denominations and beliefs and backgrounds gave money to help rebuild the Catholic Church. As for the city itself, unlike the San Francisco earthquake of a few years back where we had to raise the sales tax to pay for it, communities throughout California volunteered a certain amount of money to send up to Santa Barbara. So everybody did it on their own. In fact, kids in Pasadena sold lemonade and sold oranges on street corners, sending up nickels, pennies, and dimes to help the earthquake relief in Santa Barbara. And so we did rebuild. And almost immediately, within 24 hours of the earthquake, the Community Arts Association that I had mentioned advised that Santa Barbara should be rebuilt in the Spanish architecture. We have a blank canvas right now with State Street completely wiped out. This is our chance to build something truly unique and unusual. Within 48 hours, the newspaper headline said, "The Spanish architecture shall prevail." Santa Barbara was on its way to this new, complete Spanish architecture idea. Within 2 weeks, we had an architectural board of review. We had planning divisions, things going on. And you can't think, how fast could they do this today? It'd take them years to put it together. But within a month's time, all this was happening. In fact, a month after the earthquake, plans like this were shown in the newspaper saying this is what architects suggest for lining State Street. And if you had a business that was damaged or destroyed, you could get free plans from these architects if you built in the Spanish style. They gave you free ideas and free plans for your building. So people embrace it and people went with it, and we just have to look outside to kind of see what happened to it. To sum it all up, I'd like to go back to what Tom Stork wrote in that first edition of the newspaper that he squeezed out in De La Guerra Plaza. and I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the important parts. He says, rising above the ruin wrought by the Great Disturbance, Santa Barbara's people will prove they are worthy of their pioneer ancestors and begin at once the work of reconstruction. The people of Santa Barbara are meeting the burdens of this calamity which has fallen upon the city. The work of relief is already organized. The hand of the builder will soon begin the task of rebuilding. There will be work for many, and all must work. But in the end, Santa Barbara will come back bigger, better, and stronger than before, for the things that have made this city and the men who built it are still here. Amen.
We had just been informed that the National Weather Service had declared a flash flood watch.
Officials are saying that residents of the Mission Creek area need to prepare to evacuate.
Be radio ready.
If the county does declare a flash flood warning, then residents of the area will be told to leave their homes.
Know where to go for information during a disaster.
Some roads are closed, and I've been told that the county is providing sandbags for free to homeowners at fire stations.
To find out which stations are radio ready, go to awareandprepare.org.
Gaining weight was easy. All I had to do was sit down and eat. Losing weight's a lot harder. I have to work at it every day. But with every step, I lower my risk for type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And that makes every step, every choice, every day very much worth the effort.
Hi, hon. How was your run?
Hard, but I hung in there and did my 2 miles. How was your workout?
Great. Dinner's ready. I hope you worked up an appetite.
A healthy meal like this, you better believe it. Thanks for keeping us on track.
Hey, every step matters. We can do this.
And it's very much worth the effort.
Learn how you can help stop diabetes by losing weight, eating healthy, and staying active. Visit checkupamerica.org or call 1-800-DIABETES.
No matter where you surf, your favorite wave begins right here, on your street. That's because storm drains lead straight to our creeks and ocean. When water washes into storm drains, pollutants like detergents, oil, and pet waste go along for the ride. Help keep our creeks and beaches clean. Take your car to a car wash and always pick up after your pet. Remember, the ocean begins on your street.
This municipal course is exceptional.
It's just in better shape than it's ever been before.
This is the place to be if you really want to learn how to play golf.
You get a great course for the price.
Definitely affordable.
Great values on merchandise in the pro shop.
It's a nice, friendly atmosphere. It's absolutely gorgeous.
I thought indoor tanning was safe. They said their tanning rays were less likely to cause a sunburn.
What you need to know is UV light from indoor tanning can cause
Premature aging, including wrinkles, sagging, and age spots.
So instead of making you look cool, it can make you look old.
And even worse, UV light can increase your risk of skin cancer, including melanoma, the deadliest form of skin cancer, especially when exposed at an early age.
And treatment can be surgery, and sometimes even chemotherapy and radiation.
In fact, current estimates are that 1 in 5 Americans develop skin cancer, and 1 person dies from melanoma about every hour.
I don't want to be one of them. I don't want to be one of them. I don't want to be one of them.
This message brought to you by the American Academy of Dermatology.
I'm telling you, indoor tanning is not as safe as you think. In fact, indoor tanning is totally out.
I just had my weekly lecture about spending too much money.
What do you have to say this time?
I couldn't understand most of it. All I could get was pesos don't grow on trees.
There they are, ready to go to dinner. Fred's buying.
I'll be right back. I'm going to get my other wallet. This one has my money in it.
Fred, I have a plan. Do you want to hear it?
Lucy, we're still recuperating from your last plan.
I want to start a recycling program for the apartment building.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Oh, Ricky! Fred will listen to you. Tell him I have a wonderful plan for the building that won't cost him a cent.
Let's see. My scatterbrain wife has another half-witted scheme. If you listen to it, you're out of your mind.
Boy, did that suffer in translation. Fred, it will help the environment and lower the apartment's trash bill, which means money in your pocket.
Lucy, this is one scheme that makes sense. Dollars and cents.
Santa Barbara of the mid-1800s looked very different from the Santa Barbara we know today. The vegetation consisted mainly of grasses covering gently sloping hills, some leftover olive and fruit trees at the Mission, and a few scattered oak trees. But public land was important to the people of Santa Barbara even then.
An interesting thing that I had discovered by perusing the 1853 map of the city, which is the first official city map and the one that all of our maps are still based on, it had about 6 plots of land set aside as public plazas.
The first historical references to city parks go back even further than the 1853 Haley-Wackenreuter map. In 1840, the wedding reception of Jose de la Guerra's daughter, Anita, was described in Richard Henry Dana's popular book, 2 years before the mast. As with most community events of the time, the wedding reception took place in what is now De La Guerra Plaza.
De La Guerra Plaza has a very long history. It was sort of, if you will, the front patio or porch for the Casa de la Guerra, the home of Jose de la Guerra, who was arguably the most important citizen of Santa Barbara during the Spanish and Mexican eras. It wasn't really developed into any sort of a park until really the early part of the 20th century. It was just generally an open space, a gathering area for parties. Jose de la Guerra certainly entertained lavishly.
In the shift of prominence from the Spanish and Mexican era to the new Yankee settlers from the 1850s through 1868, half of the public land shown on the Haley-Wackenreuter map of 1853 was lost to the city as a result of non-use and squatters' rights.
Plaza Alameda in the Upper East Side, which now has 2 city blocks, originally on that map had 6 city blocks. But in the course of, say, 50 years there, prior to the creation of the Board of Park Commissioners, 4 of the blocks had been sold off because they were all public, belonged to the city, and the city was selling a lot of the Pueblo lands.
Very little of Santa Barbara's landscape changed until the latter part of the 19th century, when Santa Barbara began attracting more and more people.
In the 1870s, a man named Charles Nordhoff wrote a book about California, saying what a wonderful place it was for travelers, for health, and also to settle here. And so you started to have people come to Santa Barbara for their health, and it began to develop a reputation as a tourist destination.
Around the same time, a young carpenter and self-trained architect came to Santa Barbara. His name was Peter Barber.
There are any number of buildings in town still that he constructed. He designed the first permanent courthouse for Santa Barbara. He also designed the large Thomas Dibley mansion up on the mesa where City College is now. And probably his best-known commission was the building of the Arlington Hotel in the 1870s, which was Santa Barbara's first luxury hotel, and really was the benchmark for the beginnings of the tourist industry.
Barber was an extremely popular figure in Santa Barbara and was elected mayor twice.
One time when he was mayor, he was very much a very strong supporter for a bond issue, 1891, in which $70,000 was put aside to purchase that part of Cabrillo Boulevard between Castillo and State Street. And it was primarily his idea to beautify that portion of Cabrillo with trees and nice lighting, etc. He'd gotten this idea during a trip to Europe, primarily when he visited Geneva. And he thought that having a beautiful beachside boulevard would be a real boon for Santa Barbara.
One of the supporters for the 1891 bond measure was Dr. Augustus Boyd Doremus, who had arrived here with his family in 1882. Doremus, a dentist, was born in Louisiana but spent most of his early life in Europe. In 1882, he was told by doctors in Switzerland that he had a very short time to live, so Doremus came to Santa Barbara to regain his health. Once here, Doremus vigorously began to pursue his interest in horticulture.
The horticultural community was so closely knit, and it extended from Goleta with the Sextons out to Montecito and even to Carpinteria.
In 1893, Santa Barbara's horticultural community was joined by its most famous and productive member, Dr. Francesco Franceschi.
He was actually born in Italy into a very wealthy banking family. His name was Emanuele Fenzi. Franceschi introduced over 800 species of plants to Santa Barbara, and of that number, 163, more or less, probably more, were unique introductions to the state of California. So we'd never seen a lot of these plants before.
The growing number and influence of Santa Barbara's horticultural community in the beautification of Santa Barbara solidified with the vision of civic leaders at the turn of the century.
Tourism became ever more important to Santa Barbara. And so people could see, and city leaders could see, that there was definitely a marketing value in making the city an attractive place, a beautiful place, and make it a place that looked different from perhaps the towns, cities that tourists from the east were used to. Why go to a town that looked exactly from where you're coming from?
City Ordinance Number 401 created Santa Barbara's first Parks Commission in March 1902. Augustus Boyd Doremus was named superintendent, a position he was to hold without pay for 17 years.
They started out at that time with no authority, no budget, not a lot of things, but what they did have is vision and a few other things to their credit. And so they just set out with what they had and made it happen. And I think that vision is still there today. Of course, Boyd Doremus himself, the father of our parks, he's called, he just went out there for 17 years and gave his heart and soul.
The beginning years of the Park Commission saw the rise of two themes which have been the major components to the success of Santa Barbara's park heritage: philanthropy and strong community commitment. In the early 1900s, these themes could clearly be seen in the major areas of interest at the time: the waterfront and the acquisition of Oak Park.
One of the most important developments in the development of the waterfront was the construction and opening of the Potter Hotel in 1902. A huge luxury hotel, and that was a real magnet to bring tourists and the rich and famous, people like John Rockefeller, etc., to come and in some cases winter here in Santa Barbara. And so you did have, also with the development of the estates in Montecito, you did have people with means coming to live here for a certain amount of time or settle here. And of course they wanted to benefit the community they were now living in.
I think probably other cities have acquired parkland in similar fashions. I think probably we saw a little more generosity.
Although 58% of Santa Barbara's parkland has been acquired through gifts and donations, the first acquisitions came directly from the community. West Cabrillo Boulevard had already been acquired through the Bond Act of 1891, and in 1904 the stage was set for the acquisition of the first parkland acquired under the new Park Commission.
In the case of Oak Park and a lot of our other parks, it seems to be that the property is used by Santa Barbarans as a park before it's actually a park. And then when somebody comes along to develop it, then everybody raises up and says, you can't do this to our park, and so bond measures are passed, and it becomes park property.
Walker Tompkins always liked to tell the story of how the citizens banded together to buy that land, including school children contributing their pennies.
Oak Park was a popular picnic place around the turn of the century, and there's a little community here called Oak Park, actually, that grew around it. But it was around 1904 when this property was slated to be developed, and a man named Henry Talent said, oh, no, we got to make this a parkland. So he got a bond measure going. Now, a delightful side to this story is supposedly all the little kids at the grammar schools got their nickels and their pennies together to help purchase the park. Now, you think about it, bond measures work a different way. People don't donate money to it like that. But I think that this was part of the plan, that having the kids, you know, in their naivety, give nickels and pennies to this fund. Well, how could the parents not want to pass a park bond measure to get this park? So in 1904, the bond passed, and the 17 acres of Oak Park became part of our city park system.
Increasingly, public attention focused on the waterfront area of what is now East Cabrillo Boulevard.
Initially, East Cabrillo Boulevard was not a particularly pretty place. There was a report issued by a man named Charles Robinson in 1909. This was a report, sort of a general plan for the city, a plan of how to beautify the city, and he really came down rather hard on East Cabrillo Boulevard.
In his report to the city on East Cabrillo Boulevard, Robinson stated, "Beyond the great curve, the boulevard is suddenly bereft of attractiveness. The ocean is out of sight, a salt marsh, a railroad spur, a lumber yard, and pier taking its place. And on the railroad side there are ugly commercial buildings, neglected vacant lots, shrieking billboards."
More and more people were being attracted to the waterfront. The streetcar came down to the beach and then ran out along the boulevard. So we were getting more recreational use of that area than before.
We also have to keep in mind that Cabrillo Boulevard moved back and forth as storms wiped it out, because it was developed at the very beginning of the 20th century, and it took a few years before they could finally find a good permanent location for it where it wouldn't be regularly wiped out, and the palm trees could be retained and lawn planted and so forth. So there is still land across the street that belongs to the public. There's that idea of preservation and maintaining the public view. And that was the same thing in the mid-1920s that urged the acquisition of the land. In fact, it started much earlier than that. There was a drive in 1909 to acquire beachfront and the salt pond, the bird refuge land, to preserve it for the public. And obviously these people had seen waterfront areas that had been, where there had been blocking off.
Another person that comes to mind is David Gray, who organized an association to buy up parcels along East Cabrillo Boulevard and gave the city money to construct Cabrillo Pavilion. What's interesting is that the deal was he would give the money to build that building if the city would then put up the money to furnish it. Well, the city didn't fulfill its end of the bargain, so David Gray just went ahead and put the money up to furnish the building as well.
And that was built in 1926, and for a while people called it after him. They called it the Gray Pavilion or the David Gray Pavilion or East Beach Pavilion and Bathhouse. But he did not want it named for him. He preferred it to be called Cabrillo Pavilion, and there is a document in which he did name it Cabrillo Pavilion.
While attention continued to be focused on the East Beach area, Santa Barbara's horticultural community, led by Dr. A.B. Doremus and Francesco Franceschi, accelerated the greening of Santa Barbara's public lands.
I think the vision of the original Board of Park Commissioners and people in the community at that time is that they did want to have parks and plazas. They wanted public places for people to congregate, and that's pretty much how parks got started in the late 1800s. They built on a system of 4 parks at that time to 57 parks today, and I think the vision of green belts, greening of Santa Barbara, street trees, and the importance of our beaches started at that point in time, and it's continued through today.
What's interesting is that many of those early folks were not paid. They were strictly volunteers, and that's one of the things that we really are celebrating in this centennial, is the spirit of activism and volunteerism, that without it, this park system, in fact, this whole city, when you look at all the nonprofits and volunteer organizations, this whole city would just be would be nothing compared to what it is now.
That's our history, that's our heritage in Santa Barbara for our parks. It's philanthropy, it's giving, it's having vision for open space and vision for planting trees, street trees and park trees and color. we're fortunate to be in an environment that we can plant lots of things. That was Franceschi's vision. Our street tree program, as an example, we have 250 different varieties of trees. There's no town probably in the United States that can brag that variety of trees. And that's because of that vision that Doremus had, Ralph Stevens had, Orpit had, and even Dr. Franceschi.
For them, it was not a vocation as it is with me and many of my current counterparts. It was an avocation, and yet it was they had such a passion for horticulture and that it became an almost all-consuming thing with them.
Franceschi and Doremus teamed up to create one of Santa Barbara's most loved streetways, the Italian Stone Pines on Anapamu Street.
Dr. Doremus is the one that brought the seeds for the stone pines on Anapamu Street, and then Franceschi's the one that grew them. Dr.
Doremus, I think he owned half of the square block there between Anapamu Street going up toward Victoria, and then from Alta Vista to Salsa Puentes. Now it's all apartment buildings on those blocks. But some of the original trees he planted there on his property are still growing there, nearing 100 years of age now.
Doremus lived in Santa Barbara for 55 years. After hearing in 1882 that he would most likely die within that year, Doremus lived to see his 95th birthday in 1937. Doremus planted over 300 species of trees in Santa Barbara's 4 public parks and along the city's streets. Most of his seedlings were grown by Franceschi, and most of those were grown in Franceschi's first nursery in Santa Barbara, a place marked by the last of the original trees near the corner of Gutierrez and State Street.
It's a special type of flame tree that is also known as the Sexton flame tree, after Joseph Sexton, who actually was the one that introduced it.
The Franceschi Sexton flame tree is just one of the many examples of trees in Santa Barbara that are around 100 years old. The mature trees in Alameda Park, the Montezuma cypress in Plaza Veracruz, the Italian stone pines. After Doremus, the next 2 park superintendents were also noted horticulturalists. Ralph Stevens, who was born at what is now the Lotus Land Estate in Montecito, and E.O. Orpit. They continued the vision of Doremus with the same intensity, trusting that with time, Santa Barbara's urban forest would grow to maturity. For the first 3 decades of the 20th century, very few of Santa Barbara's streets had trees that were more than a few feet tall, or they simply still had no trees. It took years for the transformation to take place, but in 1980, Santa Barbara claimed its first Tree City USA Award, a distinction it has earned every year since. A much more rapid and equally dramatic change occurred at East Beach.
Because of the position it has along the coastline there, it was subjected to considerable storm damage. So much so that when Cabrillo Boulevard was completed in 1905, a large part of it was washed out.
Cabrillo Boulevard was partially washed out again in 1915 and in 1930.
A storm just before 1930 had threatened to undermine the Cabrillo Pavilion. So that gives you some idea as to how little sand there was protecting all of that area through there.
The transformation of the East Beach area was largely the result of one of Santa Barbara's most productive parks commissioners and influential citizens, Dwight Murphy.
In 1930, with the support, guidance, monies, and so forth of Dwight Murphy and Mrs. Clark, who has an estate up above the bird refuge, they started putting in groins. They put in 5 large groins extending out into the sea. They're all covered up by sand today, and you don't see them. This has arrested the slide of the sand down the coast. Then Dwight Murphy led an effort, which I believe cost a couple of $100,000, to build a huge retaining wall along the stretch of East Beach that runs approximately from the curve in the boulevard down to where the parking area is at the Cabrillo Pavilion. And it was just boulders piled up, but it worked, whereas 2 previous retaining walls had failed, with the result that Cabrillo Boulevard had been washed out.
Today, the rock retaining wall is marked by a strip of ice plant that runs the length of East Beach.
Dwight Murphy was one of the early visitors to Santa Barbara, and like most of our philanthropists for the city, he came here because of the Potter Hotel. His parents came here in 1904, and he was about 20 years old then, And his parents were owners of a railroad equipment company, quite wealthy. They bought a place in Montecito, which is currently the Westmont College facility. Dwight Murphy was not in the best of health. And you think with his family's money and stuff, he could have had an easy, cush job with the family's business. But instead, he took a few years off and became a forest ranger and patrolled the back country of Santa Barbara. When he came to Santa Barbara, he really began his second career, pretty much taking care of a lot of Santa Barbara's problems and finding solutions for everything. He became a park commissioner in 1927 through 1931, and certainly Pershing Park, Ortega Park, and Palm Park have his hand in the making of those parks.
It was not until 1931 that the acquisition of the waterfront was complete.
And there was one parcel left over. Right next to Stearns Wharf, there was a lumber yard, and it was slated to be sold. And some of the proposals were a Coney Island amusement park right there at the foot of Stearns Wharf, and Santa Barbara just said, oh my God, we can't do this. He helped underwrite the loan that got $200,000 to purchase the property, and then it was held until bond measure could be passed in January of 1931 to purchase that last piece. And as a result of Mr. Murphy and other Santa Barbarans, Santa Barbara now has that whole beachfront completely clean of development and open to the public.
The rehabilitation of East Beach, the creation of the bird refuge, and the development of approximately 123 acres of new parkland was left to the next park superintendent, John Hartfeld.
I was brought up in the belief from stories I'd heard that Dwight Murphy had handpicked him, found him out at the Casa del Herrero, and was so impressed with his work out there that he felt he could take on the development of the city parks. Another thing that happened just as my father became park superintendent was that the effects of the Great Depression, they called it, started to work their way across the country. And by 1931 or 2, there were hundreds of men locally that were out of work. People were losing their jobs, their homes, their pride, and so forth.
During the Depression, large numbers of unemployed men in Santa Barbara found jobs with the park department. The rehabilitation of East Beach required extraordinary measures.
And one of the things that my father did to repair it, he had at one time 580 men, unemployed men, working to rehabilitate the sand area. It was, there were large hills and valleys and so forth, and it wasn't very pleasant for beach-going purposes. And they set up a narrow gauge railroad and moved 50,000 yards of sand up and down the beach to get it in the proper locations and make a nice, attractive beach area. And since then, to my knowledge, I don't think there's been any serious problems caused by storms that have disrupted the use of the beach or the boulevard.
It was John Hartfeld and his work crews that were responsible for planting the first 175 palm trees along East Cabrillo Boulevard. They also transformed the old salt pond.
The salt pond, or now the bird refuge, was, again, in the 1920s, early 30s, kind of an ugly place.
In 1928, Mrs. Clark went to visit with Dwight Murphy on his ranch up in the San Ynez Valley. Before she got out of there, he had her commit $50,000 to develop the salt palm. She was a little bit upset with the way it looked and the fact that the city was not doing anything with it. But the biggest part of the work was it had to be dredged. They dredged it down to 6 feet. They had to haul great amounts of fresh soil on large barges out into the lake to build the 3 islands that are out there, which were to serve as a refuge for the birds. But it was a year or 2 later before they successfully eliminated the soil salt that was inhibiting all of the growth of the reeds and thrushes and so forth that were necessary for the birds.
Hartfeld and his crew also planted more than 600 trees at the bird refuge.
It wasn't long before large numbers of birds were starting to visit the bird refuge. Some unofficial counts said there were as many as 200 different varieties of birds, sometimes coming thousands at a time. And so it became a success within 2 or 3 years.
With the 42 acres of the Andre Clark Bird Refuge, named after the daughter of Mrs. Clark, and the development of East Beach and Palm Park, Santa Barbara transformed the eastern gateway to the city from what was once described as a disaster into one of the most attractive waterfront areas in the world.
We used to walk to the beach, or our mothers would take us. In the summer, I lived very close to Sycamore Creek, and we would, in the summer it was dry, so we could climb down into the creek and walk along the creek and under the highway alongside Dwight Murphy Field, and then go to East Beach and have fun. And quite often we would sneak over near the Child Estate to look at the hobo jungle, and then come back and get in trouble. I think we just should give thanks every day to some of the people I've mentioned, Harold Chase and Dwight Murphy and many of these others. Pearl Chase wrote a history of the acquisition of the East Cabrera Boulevard area, and she named all of those people. She was always very generous about giving people credit, and all the names are there.
Today, with beach and park events, the Sunday Arts and Crafts Walk, and everyday activities, Santa Barbara's waterfront area attracts more than 3 million visitors each year. The tenure of John Hartfeld as park superintendent also saw the increase of recreational activity within the city parks, the Board of Recreation Commissioners having been formed in 1929.
There's another entire story about the development of all of the recreational facilities, which really got underway with the help of the unemployed and all of the applications my father made for funds in about 1934. And that was a great year for the city because not only was Cabrillo Ballpark developed then, Dwight Murphy Field was completed, Los Baños del Mar was purchased and put under the Parks Department. It had been built years earlier by the Edison Company. The old high school block, which is more like a half a block today, between Delavina and Chapala Street, he tore down the buildings, took a lot of the materials to build facilities around the parks around town, and then he converted it into various types of game fields. He put in facilities for baseball, archery, and a number of other things. And I suspected that what the government was doing with these relief funds, apart from just employing the unemployed, was providing the public with games to keep them happy during the Great Depression.
Under Hartfeld, the city also acquired Franceschi Park. Franceschi, who had named his estate on the Riviera Montarioso, left his son Camillo Fenzi in charge of the nursery when he left Santa Barbara in 1913.
Camillo went into landscape architecture and closed the nursery, sold the property to Alden Freeman, who is always described as an eccentric East Coast philanthropist. And Freeman is the one that remodeled the house as a tribute to Franceschi's Italian heritage. It was originally a craftsman-style house, and then he converted it to look Mediterranean. And Freeman donated the park to the people of Santa Barbara in 1931.
The main terrace at Franceschi House also bears remembrance to one of the major events in Santa Barbara's history.
The mason was Del Vecchio, and he left an inscription in the terrace saying that the paving stones came from the 1925 earthquake.
The Santa Barbara earthquake of June 29, 1925, produced significant rubble from the brick and mortar buildings of downtown. As in all city emergencies, past and present, Park Department employees were very involved in relief efforts. From the June 30, 1925 Board of Park Commissioners report to the city manager, written by William Sewell. During the days following the earthquake, the parks were used very generally. We allowed the erection of temporary places of business for the banks, Chamber of Commerce, and retail stores in De La Guerra Plaza. Many people slept in the various parks, and a good many cooked their meals at Oak Park. From the rubble of the earthquake, new parkland was created in the low-lying areas of town.
Ortega Park was not one of the original 1853 parks, although on the old map there was one, a block set aside almost immediately adjacent to it. So it's kind of interesting that eventually there was a block set aside. And that happened after the 1925 earthquake. It was actually finalized in the very early 30s, and we're told that much of that land, which was a mixture of sort of semi-slough and low-lying land, it was filled with debris from the 1925 earthquake. So that enabled the junior high school, Santa Barbara Junior High School, to be built and Ortega Park to be developed.
There was still much to be done while the Depression dragged on, but John Hartfeld's next idea was one which would create an extremely positive image of Santa Barbara for many, many years to come.
He always liked to do things on a grand scale. He was given full credit for coming up with the idea of getting Santa Barbara involved in the Pasadena Tournament of Roses parades.
Well, they would make the skeleton part of it here in Santa Barbara, and then they'd break it up, take it apart, pack it up, ship it down by trucks down to Pasadena, and assemble it again.
One of the most interesting parts of it to me was that city employees, primarily the park department employees, put in their own time in the evenings after work and on weekends, and then when it was time to take it down to Pasadena, they went down there and paid for their own food and their own accommodations, and quite a number of other people besides park department people did it. And it was a gigantic undertaking, and it was supposed to have been the first float ever to have electronic communication under it, because there were 7 men working underneath it. And my father was up at the very front, a little peephole up there, and he was steering it. And what he was steering was a huge I-beam trailer that he had designed just for this purpose.
Hartfeld set a standard of excellence for Santa Barbara's float entries till the last entry in 1948.
The flour and stuff took about 2 days, and but they had down there, they'd have maybe about 4 or 5 men working, assembling the float again. Then they would send us all down like cattle in the truck with a cover over it. It was with benches inside. Here we go.
The float designed in 1935 by John Hartfeld is said to have been the largest float ever entered into the Tournament of Roses parade up to that time. The float achieved the ultimate prize, the Sweepstakes Award.
It was the day, January 1, 1935, that the Associated Press wire service went online to speak, so to speak, across the country. And the very first photo that was transmitted from the Los Angeles office was a photo of the 1935 sweepstakes winner. It was the very first photo that was ever transmitted from Los Angeles to probably hundreds, maybe thousands of newspapers throughout the country. When you look at the unity that was behind him, his employees, all the service clubs, and so many of the people in Santa Barbara that participated in one way or another. And this was in the middle of a depression. And Santa Barbara needed something to bring it together and give it something to be proud of. And this was, in those times, this is big time stuff.
The next few years were tumultuous for the Parks Department and the entire city in general, as a newcomer to town, E.O. Hansen made enough promises to win the election for mayor. The night before he was to take office, Hansen changed the locks on the doors of all the department heads of the city. John Hartfeld, one of Santa Barbara's hardest working and popular officials, was suddenly out of a job.
The mayor at that time was Crazy Hansen. We had a man here, he was white-headed old man. He caused more trouble in this town than any mayor we ever had.
One night, the doorbell rang at our house, and there was 2 detectives from the Santa Barbara Police Department standing there and telling my dad that they were there to take the trophy back because the new mayor, who had terminated my dad, thought that the city ought to have the trophy. And my father refused to give it to him, and he had it on his desk at home until a year or 2 before his death, and he then gave it to the city.
In 1938, the city hired Finley McKenzie as its new parks superintendent. McKenzie would provide direction and organization to the Parks and Recreation Department for the next 22 years. After initial setbacks in the budget from World War II, McKenzie's tenure, increased staff, welcomed new parkland, and provided the public with publications about the parks and recreation programs. The onset of a sudden illness forced Finley McKenzie to retire early from the park department in 1961.
McKenzie was one of the sweetest guys in the world. I mean, I don't know how many guys he helped down there. They were out of money, pushing cars around the corner because they were after, the collectors were after them.
McKenzie was a gentleman, a real guy, but a tough one. If you had a problem with me, he'd bawl you out, and he was man enough to come back and apologize if he was wrong. That's just the kind of a fellow he was.
And we used to go up to see him at his house at Northridge when he was sick, and he had, like Timmy were talking, he'd have tears in his eyes. Then he'd call every morning down to the yard, right, Timmy?
Yeah.
Every morning, just to see how the boys were.
In December of 1959, an anonymous donor gave $14,000 to the city for the development of a 9.5-acre parcel of land at the corner of State Street and Las Positas Road. Shortly thereafter, the new park was named in honor of Santa Barbara's longest-serving superintendent, Finley McKenzie. Although the parks budget had increased significantly under McKenzie, the Parks Department was constantly challenged financially.
Everything was broken down, stuff, old buildings, and I don't know how they ever caught on fire, I don't know.
The Park Department is always at the bottom rung of the ladder when it comes to money in either city or county governments.
We had a lot of trucks down there all tied up with wire and stuff. The ladder truck would trim trees, was on a Ford or a Chevrolet body.
That was a Chevrolet, yeah.
And you had a ladder on it, and you had to crank the ladder by hand to raise it up to be able to trim the trees. And if that wasn't high enough, we'd tie an extension to it to get the fellows to get a little bit higher.
A lot of it was by hand when I first started. Maybe we was picking up seaweed. We had the old GI truck, and everything was by hand.
I'll give you a good example, the golf course. The golf course did not have an automatic irrigation system. It had a quick coupler system. Quick cut, which means you take this rotary head and you stick it in and you turn it and the water starts going. Well, these guys are out there doing that at night. These heads shoot 80 feet. So this poor guy has to sneak up on this rotating fire hose in the middle of the night, make sure he doesn't get killed, grab it, unhook it, and take it to the next hole, which he has to find in the dark, and stick that in and then get the heck out of the way before it knocks him down. It was that kind of thing.
The same geographical and usage features that make Santa Barbara's park system unique are the same features that continue to produce maintenance challenges.
Because of the uniqueness of the park resources that we have, if someone wants to walk in Shoreline Park, for example, or walk on the beach, they have that opportunity. If they want to hike in Parma Park completely by themselves and be alone and read a book, they have that opportunity. So that diversity is very important to a community.
Of course, then we have ball fields, sports fields that we maintain, neighborhood parks, community parks, the historic parks like Alameda Parks that go back to the 1850s, garden parks like Alice Kick Park Memorial Gardens, and then historic and botanical parks like Franceschi Park, which has a lot of history plus a lot of horticulture important not only to Santa Barbara but to all of Southern California.
The maintenance challenges which reflect the diversity of Santa Barbara's parklands requires a staff with a broad range of skills and knowledge.
Not only technically qualified, but also the level of commitment we have with our staff is just tremendous, the morale and the pride in what they do.
One thing I'll tell you about the park department, very seldom did a guy ever get fired from there. They stayed till they retired or were too old. They were all good workers. You didn't have to be watching them all the time and stuff. Really, really big. Like I said, it was a great family.
In the yard, there was the boss of the yard, I called him. He called me El Patron, but he was really the patron, and I learned it very quickly. Timmy Badillo, he ran the yard.
I used to keep a lot of kids out of trouble. When I went into the ballpark, and Hitchcock told me, "What are you allowing those kids in here for?" Because I want to show them something. I want to educate them. He said, "Oh, they're going to tear the park up. They won't do no such a thing." I said, "You watch it. Let me take care of that."
He would come to me and say, "I got this young kid, Mike, You always bring some kid in trouble who needed a job. Today, you will see people in the tree trimming group or I see them now as supervisors. I see them with young children, see them with gray hair like me. And I thought to myself, Timmy Badillo did good things.
The commitment of the new folks is just as good as the guys that went out. You know, you worry we're losing guys from retirement. What's going to happen? Well, we have a new generation that's modeled after the second generation who's just as committed and cares just as much.
And that caring, I think, that whole, what do you call it, that idea, that presence of caring is still there in the park department, and I think mostly from Timmy Badillo.
In many unheralded ways, Parks and Recreation staff also help the community through some of its most trying times.
The Parks and Recreation staff become part of a larger team of emergency preparedness, and our role is to assist police and fire and public works.
The windstorm of 95, 98, we lost 200 trees in one night, and of course that was quite a devastating thing to have to deal with. Blocked streets, and our forestry crew was, were out at night and trying to clear the streets.
One thing that was pretty amazing though, in one of the floods back in 95 was actually getting called and taking out vans at convalescent homes. And there we were, Parks and Rec, there we are with large vans and going through and helping out the elderly, and that was a sad thing. Just sad and happy though, just to be able to know that we could be counted on to go the extra mile and take care of these folks.
The stories of individual parks and how they came to be provide us with the most telling pictures of the foresight, care, and giving that has been the foundation of the Santa Barbara Parks and Recreation Department since the beginning. One such story, Ealing's Park, formerly Las Positas Park, began in the humblest of circumstances.
Quite a number of years ago, this used to be the city dump. All of a sudden, they had to find a place to dump. They were running out of places where they could dump. And they considered reopening this as a dump site. That is, the city council did at that time.
We had been reading about the conversion of dumps to public open spaces and the problems associated with it. The methane gas and all the things you need to learn about.
Bill Burker was the former recreation director. It was actually Bill's idea to look at this former dump site of 94 acres and turn it into a big sports complex. So he had a design done, and it was so incredible that the World Leisure Association invited him to Bristol, England to make a presentation on it.
The city of Santa Barbara has always had men of outstanding recreation ability. They had a very fine history throughout the state for the recreation programs that were started here and some of the innovations that transpired over the years.
Bill always says that, will say that Jerry was pretty much his point guard that took the ball and ran forward with the project.
At the beginning, the greatest help I got was from Richard Johns.
A lot of people deserve the credit for making formerly Las Positas Park happen and now Ealing's Park. And I was involved with preparing a grant application to the Fleischman Foundation.
He was the guy that was responsible for us getting that $1,850,000 from the Fleischman Foundation. I know I was in it asking stuff like that, but when he went there and spoke to Mr. Bergen, I think that's what did it. A lot of people don't know that, but I know it.
That is just a wonderful example of what people who care about recreation can do. And Jerry Harwin, again, and Bill Burka, they really got the community involved and sold that project.
Ealing's Park was one of the first former dump sites in the country to be converted into a multi-use sports facility. Private donations and grants have continued to make Ealing's Park one of the centerpieces of Santa Barbara's recreation community, as well as being heavily used for special events, parties, festivals, and weddings.
A dream. It was a dream. Really was a dream. I dreamt it. And came to pass. A lot of work, but a lot of help. A lot of help. God bless all these people that are helping and have helped.
The list of dedicated individuals who pursued their vision of new parkland and recreational development is a long one.
The 1853 map also showed a Plaza de la Mesa, a Mesa Park, which they did not develop in the early years, but eventually Shoreline Park was acquired, again through a bond act, and that was through the will of the people. We had applications in asking for it to be rezoned and developed for apartments, so it would have been lost. I remember that there were a couple of city officials who said, oh, the city will never vote that bond act. We haven't had a successful bond act in years.
Looking back at Shoreline Park and the vision that people had in the early 60s, just imagine if that was housing today, and that 16 acres is not available to the public.
The things we learned from people, for example, we took aerial photographs of the park, and all the concrete paths you see around here are exactly where all the little worn ruts were, where people walked through the grassy field. We made sure that wherever a street hit Shoreline Drive, there were no trees between the end of that street and the ocean, because people are used to driving the whole length of the street and seeing the ocean. So we didn't want to destroy that. The other thing we did was we found out where the wind, I love telling this story, as you can see. We found out where the wind patterns are, and we planted all the trees in this park parallel to the prevailing wind pattern. It shifted around some, but the prevailing one. Why? So people could fly their kites in the alleys between the trees.
As with Shoreline Park, and long before with Oak Park at the turn of the century, it was the community who rallied in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to finally acquire what was known as the Wilcox property.
No one in their wildest dreams would have really thought that that would have been possible. 70 acres of prime coastal property, just beautiful property.
A local community organization called Small Wilderness Area Preserves fought to save the Wilcox property from development and then to purchase it. After campaigning for 2 bond measures which narrowly failed, Small Wilderness Area Preserves and the city found matching state grants and grants from foundations and individuals in a dramatic attempt to purchase the land.
We got all kinds of swell publicity from the news press, from the television. Huell Hauser came out and walked around with us, you know, lived it up. And so we got to a point where we had 6 weeks to raise the rest. All this we were raising a little bit of money, and we had 6 weeks to finally match it. And we got out and really got to see the right people, and everybody helped. And it was one of those 30-hour deals where we weren't sure whether they were going to make it or not, but we had to make it.
I would just say to people who are saying, you know, what kind of difference can I make? Sometimes it's just your voice, even if you can't open up your wallet and put money toward a cause. Just showing that care, that it's an important thing to the community is often the key that makes the big things happen.
It was a little more urgent at the time, you know, to get the word out that we should preserve this for public use. So we had a lot of shows that featured this property, and so I would come more and do paintings that we would sell for, you know, in benefit exhibitions.
I feel that I've done something that I wasn't really realizing at the time how important it was. But the older I get, the more I recognize that all we save today is all that's going to be saved.
As the deadline approached, a large donation by Michael Douglas in honor of his father, Kirk Douglas, ensured the saving of the Wilcox property for the people of Santa Barbara to enjoy forever. Near the east entrance to the Douglas Family Preserve is a large stone plaque engraved with many of the names of some of the larger contributors. Also on the plaque is a dedication, which states in part, "Here you may walk in peace. Here you may walk in time and history. Here you may experience an ancient beauty. Here the community said yes. Through the people of Santa Barbara's generous spirit and ability to prevail, here you may find yourself."
The whole thing inspires me. Nature, I think inspires all of us. We don't know exactly what it is about it, but there is a vital force that, you know, we take in. I take it in through my, you know, walking, through my lungs, you know, through my eyes when I'm painting, through my thoughts, everything. It comes in me, and that serves me for the rest of my day. I like to celebrate that there's such a thing. Inspiration.
So again, it's kind of the community itself saying, we need this. It wasn't necessarily the city government or any other agency saying we should do these things. The community itself said, we want this, we can do this, let's make it happen, and they made it happen.
Some of the projects I'm the most proud of came from somebody on a neighborhood community group who said, you know, we really need a playground in this neighborhood. And enough people saw the value in that to work the land deals, to find the budget, to go for the grants, to get donations, to make those sorts of things happen.
It was a certain community group and individuals who for years pursued what at first was one of Santa Barbara's most controversial park projects.
Day one of the skateboard park goes back something like 14 years. At the time, nobody even knew what a skateboard park was. Municipal skateboard parks were very rare. The most difficult part is finding the right site for it. People have certain perceptions about what it would be like to have a skateboard park in their neighborhood, and generally it was a toss-up between that and having a slaughterhouse.
For years, the proposed location of the skateboard park changed as each attempt to find a home for it attracted opposition. The design elements also required critical attention.
Probably the most fun was working with the kids, because the process we used was using landscape architects who had some expertise, and then trying to design a skateboard park that really worked for this community, because there's all different styles of skating. And we're also blessed to have a large professional skateboard community here. We have quite a few manufacturers, pro skaters, so the team process worked really well.
The final choice for the location of Santa Barbara's skateboard park surprised a lot of people.
Originally, when we looked at putting it down there, it seemed like, well, you know, it would be wonderful if we could, but nobody's going to let us put a skateboard park down on the beach. That's just too precious. And it ended up that by default, after losing the sites that we did, we said, okay, why not the beach? The really heartwarming thing was when we finally went to the State Coastal Commission. That was exactly what they expressed. They said, it's so wonderful of Santa Barbara to be taking this prime real estate and giving it over to the kids. We've been waiting for a project like this for years so we could approve something, and they were commending us.
Often, the community of Santa Barbara participates and connects with their parks in a big way.
Probably the biggest effort we've had in my memory is Kids World, where the entire community came out and in 4 days built a playground. It's a little bit of an illusion. It was more than 4 days. It was a year of planning, coordination with the Chamber of Commerce. But I still go there and hear people who are bringing their relatives on their first visit to Santa Barbara and say, see that rail over there? I helped sand that. And, you know, little Timmy helped drive the nails on this thing and still has 10 fingers.
Santa Barbara's Parks and Recreation Department has grown from 4 parks in 1902 to 57 parks today, 100 years later. Most of the parkland, 58%, has been given directly to the city. Most of the rest has been acquired through the will and determination of the community, through bond measures, grants, and the organization of community donations. It is this same generosity, commitment, and determination on the part of the larger parks community that will face the challenges ahead and continue maintaining and improving Santa Barbara's unique park system.
One of our biggest challenges today is finding enough space to develop active sports fields for soccer particularly, and youth baseball, adult softball.
I think there's still opportunities to find open space and put in neighborhood parks. We still need to put in some parks, I think, on the west side of town.
Probably the most recent new park on the west side is Parque de los Niños, and that's a real treasure to me. It's just a little banana slice of a piece of property carved out of some railroad property, and it's a very small park, but it just brought that neighborhood to life. You know, we can spend millions of dollars on the big parks and make them beautiful things for magazine spreads, but when I walk through a park and I just see families together and enjoying each other's time, to me that's the good that we really do here.
A number of years ago there were 3 or 4 attempts, and actually reaching the ballot, to sell some of the small pieces, like Sylvan Park and Loma Media Park, and very small pieces. And I'm just happy to see that the people just said no.
Wherever there's an opportunity to establish additional parkland, even small areas, we'll look to do that.
Parks give us all the consistency of being a community together. We relive the same things. Those of us that have had the fortunate ability to stay here through generations, we just realize how the parks are really that thread through our families and through each generation.
And I often say that people can pretty much take parks for granted because they look so beautiful and they're well maintained, and somebody's making that happen. And those park employees are doing it every day. They're making sure that plants are fertilized and pruned, they're picking up litter, and they're doing the best that they can day in and day out to keep our parks beautiful. So, you know, say thank you to them or approach them and tell them how much you care about the parks. I think they'd appreciate it.
The kids. The kids is one thing that I always enjoyed working with.
The enjoyment and thrill of knowing that a lot of people are enjoying some part of life to get away, get away from other things. Yeah, that's important in a person's life.
The satisfaction that comes just from seeing a family, you know, I used to tell my rangers, it's hard for families to get together. Think about it. Both are working these days. So if you see a family in a park all together, make sure you greet them. It wasn't easy for them to get there. Make sure you do what you can to make their stay pleasant, because they may only do this twice a year. You don't know. It's tough for a whole family to go to one place at the same time. So say hello. It's important to them. You know, this is a big day in their life. You know.
Minutes away. Hours of fun. See another world. Stearnsport, your local, affordable source for family fun.
Shouldn't that go into recycling?
Recycling. Recycling. Everybody knows the trash gets sorted. We don't need no stinking recycling.
Fact is, no trash gets sorted, friend. So if it goes in there, it just ends up at a landfill.
There's only one way to settle this. Draw.
Barbara Recycles.
As kids, we take on some tough opponents every day. Too much TV, soda after soda, junk food, and their captain, obesity. And the best way to beat this lineup is to get out and play soccer. Running with friends, kicking a ball, playing outside every day. You can do it. You're a winner. Get out and get in the game.
The abundance of mountains, hills, natural areas, creeks, and beaches contributes to Santa Barbara's reputation as one of the most beautiful areas in the world. We all live in a watershed, land that is drained by a creek system that flows to the ocean. The health of our creeks and beaches is linked to the health of our watersheds. There are 4 major watersheds in Santa Barbara. The Arroyo Burro watershed on the west flows from its headwaters in the Los Padres National Forest down through the Upper State Street commercial area and continues through the Arroyo Burro estuary, ending at Hendry's Beach. The Mission Creek watershed, which includes in its upper reaches the Botanic Garden and Rattlesnake Creek, flows through downtown to the ocean near the wharf. The Sycamore Creek watershed on the east flows through Parma Park and the Riviera neighborhoods, past the zoo and to the ocean at East Beach. The Laguna Creek watershed, once an extensive estuary, is now mostly below ground, in pipes, and meets the ocean by Chase Palm Park. Imagine the first large rainstorm of the year. All of the pollution that has been building up in our neighborhoods over a long, dry Santa Barbara summer gets washed down storm drains and heads straight for the creeks and ocean. Oil from parking lots, dog waste from sidewalks, pesticides and fertilizers from lawns, and soap from driveways all flow straight to the ocean. This can also happen when it's not raining, when water from car washing, hosing, and overwatering lawns sends urban runoff into the street, picking up pollution along the way. In order to address these challenges, our community is working to better understand the sources of pollution and educate residents about what they can do to improve water quality. Santa Barbara's beaches and the ocean play a large role in shaping the city's character and defining our quality of life. We all play an important role in preserving and enhancing our watersheds. To better understand sources of pollution, the City Creeks Division conducts water testing in creeks, storm drains, lagoons, and the ocean. So what is in the water? Water quality monitoring over the last 5 years tells us that during dry weather, overall water quality is good. In the summer, most pollutants, other than bacteria and nutrients, are detected at low levels. During storms, however, pollution flushes through storm drains and creeks into the ocean. Higher levels of pollutants are detected, including detergents and soaps, oil and grease, dirt, trash, and bacteria.
During the first rain event of the year, and during the first 15 minutes or even half an hour of that rain event, the highest concentrations of pollutants are delivered to the creeks. The entire storm event will carry additional pollution, but we are sometimes looking for a needle in a haystack trying to find the problem pollutants, and so we often gear our sampling towards looking at the worst case scenario.
Water quality monitoring has linked storm runoff with high levels of indicator bacteria in creeks and ocean water. Bacteria are everywhere: the air, soil, water, and inside animals, including humans. They are microorganisms, tiny forms of life, and invisible to the naked eye. They act as nature's recyclers, breaking down waste and chemical pollution in the environment. A teaspoon of garden soil has 1 billion bacteria. Most are good for us, but some bacteria, called pathogens, can cause disease. Water quality monitoring tests for levels of fecal indicator bacteria, normal inhabitants of human intestines. The bacteria themselves may not be harmful, but if test results indicate human waste is present, it may also contain these disease-causing pathogens.
Indicator bacteria are groups of bacteria that are always present in human intestines, sewage, human waste, and so they're tested and used to infer whether sewage or human waste is present in ocean samples, beach water samples. Indicator bacteria can also come from other sources. They can come from intestines and waste of other animals, other warm-blooded animals. They can grow naturally in soils, along surfaces, in creeks and storm drains.
Because storms carry pollution to the ocean, rainy years tend to be linked with poor water quality. Statewide water quality this season has been above average, due in large part to the record low rainfall in California. In 1995, however, during a season of heavy rains, the county began taking ocean water quality samples at local beaches. Several beaches showed high levels of indicator bacteria, which can be linked to skin rashes, sinus infections, and other stomach bugs. In September 1996, the county began regular testing of beaches between Rincon and Guadalupe Dunes. Currently, 20 beaches are sampled. As part of the program, weekly test results are distributed to the public.
Well, we have two types of signs. The warning signs or advisories mean that the sampling that I've done has exceeded the state standards. And so you'll see a yellow sign posted on each side of the creek, and really it means just stay out of the water 50 yards either side of the creek. And in addition to that, we recommend after a rainstorm, stay out of the water for 72 hours, particularly around creek mouths and storm drains.
When you get your first rain, it all flows off into the creeks, collecting all the dog fecal matter and such, and it's just, I don't want to see that in the ocean.
Within the county, medical providers and labs are required to report outbreaks and cases of serious illness such as hepatitis A. No reports of serious illnesses have been attributed to swimming in local creeks or the ocean. Water quality at the beach is affected by the quality of water flowing into the ocean from local creeks. The City Creeks Division conducts weekly sampling for indicator bacteria at over 30 sites within the city's watersheds.
This is Rattlesnake Creek. This is one of the sites that we sample.
But sampling for indicator bacteria does not always provide a true and accurate picture of water quality. One of the main challenges with the standard method of sampling is that the source of indicator bacteria is unknown.